Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. It should be a fun conversation. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Plenty we can talk about tonight, and away we go.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you with us. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Now, the way we work here is that I do some opening remarks, and then I follow my opening remarks by doing a roll call where we find out who's on the other side of the camera. I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, after that, I then answer your super chat questions for the rest of the night. We already got us one super chat question. So there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show. Shoot me a super chat. I'll be writing them down as the show progresses. So just shoot me a super chat if there's something you want me to reflect on in the second part of the program when we talk. Yeah, so that's how it works. Like button, subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell so you get notified, so you find out when we're doing these. And something you want me to talk about, super chats. That's what makes the second half of the show good. So anyway, folks, the news that just came in is that it appears that Kari Lake has been declared to have lost the Arizona governor's race. And that kind of continues the aftermath of the Tuesday vote, in which there were some Republican gains, but not that many. It seems like the Republicans didn't do as well as many people were expecting. And so we're already being told, I mean, the votes aren't even in yet in some of these races. Oh, free Assange. Absolutely. Free Assange. And thank you, SFT. The results aren't even in some of these races yet, but we're already being told that what we're supposed to take from this election is that populism is dead. Populism is dead. The Trump movement is dead. It's all done. That's what we're being told to take from this election. And I think that's a bit naive, because there's plenty of unrest and anger boiling beneath the surface. And there is plenty of distrust of mainstream media and anger at the status quo. It appears that in the aftermath of Donald Trump leaving office, that there have been some compromises made. There have been some negotiations that have happened. And it seems like the circumstances that allowed Donald Trump to be president and allowed him to have the broad support from media and different forces that he had, those seem to have been adjusted. And it may be that the Trump coalition isn't as strong as it once was. But Donald Trump and his movement and the people who supported him, they're still very much in existence. And there's still a lot of anger beneath the surface at the status quo. It may be that the Trump movement doesn't end up continuing to be the voice of it, but it may be that they do. This is simply a moment where we're not seeing the strength electorally from the Trump movement that one had expected. All right. Thank you very much. And yes, I'm glad to be back. And again, if you think that the American status quo, okay, you think that the American status quo if you think that that American status quo is going to hold, that there's not going to be opposition from below, you're completely wrong. Now, I will say that Donald Trump was one expression of opposition to the status quo, and it was a very flawed expression of opposition to the status quo. I mean, Donald Trump was president for 4 years, and it was 4 years of disaster. He brought us to the brink of world war by murdering Qasem Soleimani, the national hero of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was a blatant show of support for Israel. He escalated criminal sanctions on Venezuela. He deregulated Wall Street. He really didn't enact any economic moves to make life better for average Americans. He simply engaged in kind of libertarian free market reforms. Donald Trump's presidency in a lot of ways was a disaster. Now, Donald Trump didn't seem as excited to go to war as Biden is, and he seemed more willing to negotiate. I really liked what Trump did on the Korean Peninsula and his meetings with Kim Jong-un, being the first president to ever visit North Korea. That was certainly historic. And Donald Trump didn't seem to want to escalate with Russia the same way Biden wants to. I think that was good. Donald Trump also gave legitimacy and spoke the truth about the military-industrial complex and how they are pressing for war. He told the truth about how basically, even though Saudi Arabia is a brutal autocracy, that for economic reasons, to sell them weapons and make money from it, to get their oil, the United States is backing them. Donald Trump, in many ways, he kind of gave voice to those who have criticism of the status quo. And that's why he was deemed to be unforgivable. That's why he was deemed intolerable by the American status quo. He was, to some degree or other, a Bonapartist and a wild card. He gave expression to what many people in the United States that are critical of the status quo believe, and they couldn't tolerate that. You know, he ended up losing the election in 2020. And there was a huge concerted effort on part of the mainstream media, on part of the, the political establishment, a whole mobilization to remove him. One thing that was also very clear is that in order to remove Donald Trump, huge compromises were made among the Democratic Party with the neocons. John Bolton, who'd been in the Trump administration, was moved into the Biden camp. The Biden administration has not brought back the Iran nuclear deal, has not rolled back any of Trump's attacks on Cuba and the sanctions on Cuba that Trump imposed. It's not restored things with Cuba the way Obama did. The Biden administration has largely not undone a lot of Trump's moves, whether it was the tariffs on China, et cetera, because they compromised with people in the Republican camp, people in the neoconservative camp, in order to get it done. Trump was defeated in what seemed to be an all-out mobilization by the bulk of the ruling class, and that a lot of the elements that are on board with Trump during his presidency seemed to have jumped ship. The FBI was moving against Donald Trump and supporting his ouster. It seems like we now realize that the FBI was doing everything it could to suppress, Hunter Biden's laptop and that whole scandal, and do everything they could to prevent it. We know that Facebook and Twitter wouldn't allow stories about Hunter Biden's laptop to be posted on social media. Social media was gunning against Trump. The mainstream media was gunning against Trump. Many of the Republicans within his own camp were moving against Trump, and Trump was removed. And now Biden has come in, and things haven't gotten any better. The economy has gotten a lot worse. The international situation has gotten worse. The situation in the country has deteriorated. The Biden, the restoration of normality, the reestablishment of the status quo in Washington, D.C. has not really improved things in the United States. Okay. So, it's been an interesting week as we come out of those midterm elections. But some other things have happened that you won't hear about on mainstream TV. Well, actually, in this case, it was something that was on mainstream TV for half a second, and then they obscured it. This is actually something that was shown on mainstream TV. If you haven't already seen this, you should see this. For half a second, CNN was forced to acknowledge the Nazi problem that they have in Ukraine. CNN actually showed, by accident, it seems, a Ukrainian military person giving a Nazi salute on air. And then after that, CNN and mainstream media was essentially banned from the war zones by the Ukrainian government. This happened.
Flags and cheering for the soldiers.
See that again? That was on live television.
Earlier this week, residents there have been celebrating their long-awaited freedom, many taking to the streets, waving flags.
Wow, what is that? What is that? There's no Nazis in Ukraine, though. That's totally a conspiracy theory. Anyone who says that the people who tear down World War II memorials, the people who have torchlit marches to honor a Nazi collaborator named Stepan Bandera, anyone who says that is just repeating Russian propaganda. It's right there on the TV.
This week,
right there on the TV.
Residents there have been celebrating their long-awaited freedom, many taking to the streets, waving flags.
You know, whenever I point this out to people, the truth about the Nazi problem in Ukraine, they say, "Oh, I don't trust your source. This person you said one time they said blank, or they're somehow this, or they're somehow that, and don't trust them." Well, look at this. This is CNN. This is mainstream American media. It doesn't get more mainstream than CNN. And on CNN, they actually showed, for half a second, they actually showed a Ukrainian military person giving the Nazi salute. They showed it. It was on television. It was actually on CNN. So even CNN can't do a good job of covering up the actual nature of the Ukrainian government. The folks who have outlawed all the communist groups, have been targeting ethnic minorities, have been torturing the disabled people and doing scientific experiments on them. And now the latest, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, but in the areas that the Ukrainian military has seized, the areas that Russia has withdrawn from, in those areas, they've been engaging in retaliatory killings and torture. They've been tying people to lampposts and doing horrendous things to people. We can't show any of the video of what they're doing, but the video is out there, and they're not ashamed of it. They're very proud of doing it. They want to intimidate anyone who is suspected of having Russian sympathy, and it's all right there in front of our faces. The fascist nature of the Kiev government, the Azov battalion, and the elements that think Hitler was right in the Second World War, that think the Soviet Union was the main evil, that think that Stepan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator and a participant in the Holocaust, was a hero. Those elements are predominant among the Ukrainian forces. They are there. They exist. They're celebrated. Zelensky being Jewish doesn't change that in any conceivable way. And CNN can't even really do a good job of covering it up. It is just so much of a reality of the situation. And that brings me to what I thought would be kind of my opening remarks for tonight. I am really sick and tired of being lectured about fascism by liberals. Let me reemphasize that. I am so sick and tired of being lectured about fascism by liberals. Liberals have absolutely no right to talk about fascism. Defenders of capitalism and American imperialism have absolutely no right to lecture Marxists and anti-imperialists about fascism. And I'm really, really sick of hearing their distorted, historically incontextual understanding of the Second World War and of fascism. I really don't like hearing it, because they don't know what they're talking about. And it makes them feel all high and mighty and important to talk about fascism. But the reality is they don't know what they're talking about. Now, if you want to talk about fascism, the book that I recommend you read, let's see if I've got it up here on the shelf. The book that really I have learned the most about fascism, here we are, is this book. I've recommended it. It's called Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt. And it was written in the early 1930s by a leader of the Communist Party of Britain, R. Palm Dutt. He was of Indian descent. He was a prominent leader of the Communist Party of Britain. And he wrote this very, very important book. You can find a PDF of it on archive.org online. You can order copies of it. Fascism and Social Revolution, the study of the economics and politics of the extreme stages of capitalism and decay. This is a really, really important book. This gets into the economics of what fascism actually is, where it comes from, etc. And it's really important. If you want a scientific understanding of fascism, read this. Or go and read the writings of Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist International during the Popular Front era. There is a scientific understanding of fascism that is out there. And generally among communists, you get three definitions of fascism. And the three definitions of fascism that you get from communists generally go like this. The standard definition of fascism that you get from communists, which is awful, which is the definition that the Communist Party USA uses, the definition that is used by Social Democrats, Democratic Socialists of America, and liberals as well, is that fascism is the right wing. As the right wing gets more authoritarian, as the right wing gets more extreme, we're drifting closer to fascism. It's creeping fascism. It's moving toward fascism. That's the standard definition that you get. And that is not correct. I mean, there are extreme right-wing forces all over the world. There are right-wing governments. There's all kinds of right-wing politics out there. And that is not the essence of fascism. So that's the first definition. Second definition of fascism is a definition that you get from Trotskyite communists. And Trotskyites define fascism as a movement of the middle class that is against both big capital and the labor movement. It's a movement of the middle class that engages in extra-legal violence and terror against the working class movement, and that at the last minute, when it looks like capitalism is in severe danger, the ultra-rich, the ruling class, will hijack and use this violent movement of the middle class to save capitalism by crushing the labor movement, hand over the government to these middle-class extremists that are against both big capital and the labor movement. That's not exactly right. There's an element of truth in that definition, but it doesn't really get it. It's not the essence of it. And then the third definition, and this is an interesting one, and it's also wrong, and this is the definition that you get from Maoists, and you get it from, the Communist Party had this definition during the early 1930s, during what they call the Third Period. And it's that fascism is an attempt to imitate communism on the part of the capitalist class. If somebody sounds like a communist, but they're not, then they're a fascist, right? Fascism is anything that's not communist revolution that seeks to address the problems of capitalism, right? If it's trying to save capitalism, but it's not a communist revolution, if it's trying to fix the problems of capitalism, it's not a communist revolution, it's fascist, right? All three of those definitions have a grain of truth in them, and all three of them are wrong. Fascism is authoritarian and right-wing. That's true. Fascism is generally a middle-class movement, and it tends to gain when there's a real threat to capitalism, and it can be used by big capitalists. Yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. Fascism is an attempt to stabilize capitalism and resolve the problems of capitalism without actually overturning capitalism. So it's that. But none of those three definitions really get to the essence of what fascism is. And if you read R. Palm Dutt, if you read Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dutt, you will get a scientific understanding of what fascism actually is, which is that fascism is an attempt to stabilize and save capitalism with degrowth, with driving down economic living conditions by creating slave labor to stimulate corporations. It is an attempt to mobilize for war, to crush the labor movement, to drive down living conditions, to stabilize capitalism with war and destruction and deterioration of living conditions and creating an underclass of slave laborers. It is an attempt to rescue capitalism with degrowth through mobilizing society and creating a heavy-handed authoritarian state that will carry out degrowth, drive down living conditions, reduce the population, create a layer of slave laborers, spend lots of money on the military, and prepare for war in an attempt to save capitalism, right? We know about how capitalism has this built-in problem of overproduction, that eventually there's not enough workers being hired, and the wages are not enough to buy the products that are being produced, that the more technology advances, the poorer people get. This is the built-in problem of capitalism. And that fascism is an attempt to save capitalism from these built-in problems by enacting policies of degrowth, by downsizing, essentially, by reducing whole layers of the population to extreme poverty, and by preparing for war, and by establishing a highly authoritarian state in order to carry out these dramatic measures to try and stimulate the economy. That is the essence of fascism. Fascism is degrowth capitalism at the point of a gun. It is heavy-handed authoritarianism. It is when the liberal Western capitalist societies collapse into illiberalism in order to prevent a communist revolution and resolve a capitalist crisis. That is the essence of fascism. It's a form of Bonapartism, when one section of the ruling class asserts its will over other sections of the ruling class. And communists are the best anti-fascist fighters because they mobilize the resistance of the working class to fight for jobs and healthcare and living conditions. They mobilize workers to overcome differences of race, religion, nationality, and to see their common interest in struggle. The communists put forward a historical progressive vision, a vision of historical progress, wanting to raise living standards and build a better life for the people. They promote science and technology, and communists are the most effective anti-fascist fighters. They are the antithesis of fascism. And often, communists have come to power on the basis of beating back a fascist attempt, a fascist coup, right? If you look at what happened during the Second World War, the communists were at the center of a popular front against fascism with Roosevelt and other progressive figures. They were at the center of a popular front against fascism. And by doing so, they really increased their power and their influence among the working class and among society at large. Eventually, it was this anti-fascist United Front that led to spreading socialism to Eastern Europe, spreading socialism to China, spreading socialism to North Korea. And in many parts of the world, the communists took power on the basis of building and leading an anti-fascist United Front in Yugoslavia and Albania and elsewhere. So fighting fascism is a good thing to do. But in order to fight fascism, you have to understand scientifically what fascism actually is. And if you think fascism is just people being racist, if you think fascism is just people not being politically correct, if you think fascism is big, mean, scary people, if you think fascism is that checklist, that silly checklist that they've made where it's like honoring the past and using symbols, you don't understand what fascism really is. And on that basis, you can't really fight fascism. All right. So I want to start playing some video here from liberals, and you're gonna hear them trying to talk about fascism, trying to talk about Donald Trump being a fascist, which Donald Trump is not a fascist. I mean, he may have appealed to bigotry against immigrants or Muslims. He may have been more of a Bonapartist than other sections of the ruling class, but he wasn't a fascist. But we're gonna hear liberals talking about fascism, and we're gonna see just how confused and out of touch their understanding of fascism really is. This is Rachel Maddow.
But one of the lessons that emerges quickly when you spend time looking at this history of the violent ultra-right, not just internationally, but here in the United States, one of the things that just comes home again and again is that fascist, violent, authoritarian messaging very, very, very often comes with a big heaping helping of anti-Semitism. People who want to throw a government by force, people who want to get rid of democratically elected leaders and instead install some leader using violence, whipping people up toward believing that there's no political solution, that there has to be violence instead, that there are enemies who have infiltrated the country, and so the whole thing needs to be burned down and cleansed and started over, this time with us in charge. And that whole line of argument, that whole form of insidious messaging.
Hold up. Hold up. Hold up. First of all, Hitler took power democratically in an election. He was in a coalition with the right wing and was appointed chancellor. Mussolini took power in a coup, a military coup, the March on Rome, that had support from the highest levels of political power. Franco in Spain, he took power, in a civil war and was being supported by all the Western capitalist countries for the most part. Only the Soviet Union and Mexico came to the aid of Spain. Where has fascism come to power in some kind of revolt that burns down the entire country? Generally, that's not what happens. When we've seen countries move toward fascism, whether it was Spain or Germany or Italy, it hasn't been a big revolt that burns down the entire country. That's just not how it happens. Generally, fascists are brought to power by the political establishment as a response to continued unrest and instability. And what was that she said beforehand? Let's roll this back just a little bit. What was this she said beforehand?
Perennially targeted, scapegoated, and insinuated against by people who are making those kinds of arguments. It happens over and over again around the world.
What was this she said before?
Full cabal that's secretly in charge and pulling all the strings, and they need to be rooted out. Again and again and again, over time, and in lots of different countries, but including in ours, that is core to fascist and authoritarian messaging. And Jewish people are perennially targeted.
She said something before that.
Infiltrated the country, and so the whole thing needs to be burned down.
Yeah,
and
there we go. There we go. What did she say here? That
they're using violence, whipping people up toward believing that there's no political solution, that there has to be violence instead, that
there's no political solution and there has to be violence.
Enemies who have infiltrated the country, and so the whole thing needs to be burned down. And
there's enemies that have infiltrated the country, and the whole thing needs to be burned down.
Cleansed and started over, this time with us in charge.
And the whole thing needs to be burned down and cleansed, with the whole thing starting over with us in charge. Where have I heard that before? The country's been infiltrated. Infiltrated. Would that mean that like some other country meddled in the elections and there's a bunch of secret Nazis somewhere in the government? And so instead of trying to make the country better, we have to just burn it down and tear it down and burn it down. And the American flag is racist and the American flag is fascist. And anyone who waves the flag or want to make the country better needs to be beaten up and killed. And we'll burn it down and we'll tear it down and then we'll put us in charge. That doesn't sound like the message of any Donald Trump supporting organization. That sounds an awful lot like the message of the synthetic left to me. That sounds a lot like Antifa, right? The fascists generally go around claiming they're trying to restore the greatness of the past. They're going to make America great again. That's what the far right generally puts out, right? The far right is saying we want to restore the past. We want to glorify things. And it seems like it's the unhinged, nutty ultra left that generally put out the message that the country is irredeemable and must be burned down and destroyed and rebuilt with us in charge. Fascism and the far right generally appeal to making things the way they used to be. It's a reactionary conservative movement. But what she's promoting there, this message that she's putting out here, that there's people that want to burn down the entire country because it's quote unquote irredeemable, and then take it over themselves. That doesn't sound like fascism to me. That sounds like Antifa. That sounds like the synthetic left, right? And so I don't know what she's getting at there. All right, writing it down. Okay. Austrian and Portuguese fascism. So, I'm just not seeing how that's a fascist message. That sounds like an unhinged ultra leftist, new left, counterculture, anarchist, new left message to me. You're going to burn down the whole country and it's irredeemable, and you're going to take, and then once it's destroyed, you're going to be in charge. I don't hear fascists ever saying that. I don't even hear genuine communists and Marxists talking that way. That sounds like the synthetic left. But continue, Rachel.
That whole line of argument, that whole form of insidious messaging,
which fascists never use,
depends on there being an other, right? Some sort of very powerful cabal that's secretly in charge and pulling all the strings, and they need to be rooted out.
So you hear that? So you're not allowed to believe that this country has a group of secret rulers. You can't say that Wall Street is pulling the strings and that big corporations and banks are pulling the strings, right? You can't say that the people with the money make the rules and the rich and powerful are running things behind the scenes. She just said that's fascist, right? That's fascist, apparently. If you talk about a secret cabal, if you talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, if you talk about the American Enterprise Institute, if you talk about Wall Street and the big oil monopolies and the Silicon Valley fascists, if you talk about any of that, you're a fascist. You're anti-Semitic, right? I mean, she just said that if you believe that there's some powerful group pulling the strings, you're a fascist. Well, I mean, a lot of people think that, and a lot of people realize that to be the case, that he who has the gold makes the rules, and that we are ruled by the billionaire monopolies, the big banks and the corporations that run the world. And believing that is not called fascism. That's just called basic anti-capitalism. However, there is a big attempt on the part of the political establishment to declare all anti-capitalism to be anti-Semitic. Jonah Goldberg, the editor of National Review magazine, he wrote an article, you can look this up, called Karl Marx's Jew-Hating Conspiracy Theory. And he argues that all criticism of capitalism is anti-Semitic because rich is code for Jew. That is what Jonah Goldberg argues. That's where this is going. And they said it against Jeremy Corbyn. There were Labor Party folks in the Labor Party that were against Jeremy Corbyn, and they said this too. They said, well, we all know that anti-capitalism is just coded hatred for Jews. Anti-capitalism is just anti-Semitism. That's where they're headed with this. If you criticize capitalism in any way, somehow that's declared to be covert anti-Semitism, even though Karl Marx himself was Jewish, even though the main argument that actual Nazis and fascists make is they believe Marxism and socialism and communism are Jewish conspiracies or foreign conspiracies that they're going to root out with their fascism. Actual fascists hate communism and hate Marxism with every ounce of their souls. Actual fascists tend to support imperialism and want to restore the greatness of colonialism. Mussolini colonized Libya, colonized Ethiopia. Germany wanted to retake the colonies that were stripped away after World War I. That's what the Nazis were all about, was trying to retake the colonies they'd lost in World War I. That actual fascists love imperialism. Actual fascists hate communism. Actual fascists are big supporters of the big banks and corporations. The Nazis did business with Henry Ford and had all kinds of wealthy capitalists tied in with them. Many corporations were involved. You can read the book IBM and the Holocaust. But oh no, if you think there's a shadowy elite, if you think there's a group of rich people that have power in the United States, if you think that, then you're a fascist. And if you think that the political establishment is controlled by rich and powerful forces, then you are a fascist. I mean, this is where it's going. Any criticism of the status quo is essentially fascism as far as they're concerned.
Again and again and again, over time and in lots of different countries, but including in ours, that is core to fascist and authoritarian messaging. And Jewish people are perennially targeted, scapegoated, and insinuated against by people who are making those kinds of arguments. It happens over and over again around the world and in our history, too, even though we don't often like to remember it happening here. We like to look back at the late 30s and the 40s and remember that we were the country that joined the fight against Hitler and stopped what he was doing. Right? That's true.
And you know why? Because of this organization that was funded by Russia called the Communist Party that aligned with a president, Roosevelt, who packed the Supreme Court in order to get what he wanted and supported illegal protests by workers seizing their factories and regulated Wall Street and, spent government money to hire the unemployed to build infrastructure, and said that Stalin was a person that he liked. That's why. It's because of this malign foreign influence, this subversive foreign element called communism that built the labor unions, that aligned with Roosevelt against Henry Ford, against Henry Morgan, against the big corporations and banks. It's because of them that the United States was on the side of the people of the Soviet Union against the Nazis. It's because of them that the United States was in the Democratic alliance against the fascists, right? So she's on here every night whipping up Russophobia, anti-Russian hysteria, anti-communism, hostility to Russia, hostility to China, when she ignores the fact that the reason, one of the major reasons the United States was on the right side of World War II was because of a pro-Russian, pro-Soviet organization that supported Stalin. They got money from the Soviet Union called the Communist Party. But let's not get into, historic important details while she lectures us on the history of fascism.
Also, there's this truth is stranger than fiction, dark history of the forces in our country who wanted us either not to fight Germany, or if we were going to fight, they wanted us to fight on Hitler's side. This is all imagery from the United States that we're showing here on the screen right now.
Yeah. And I wonder what those people thought about Ukraine. I wonder about, what side the Ukrainians who fled to the United States during the 1930s, what side would they have been on in this little disagreement, Rachel? And while we're at it, what were all these fascists during the 1930s, like William Dudley Pelley and Father Coughlin, what were they always ranting against? Against communism and foreign conspiracy and Moscow. The American Liberty League was a group of Democrats who quit supporting Roosevelt because he was friendly to the Soviet Union. And what did Al Smith say at the founding convention of the American Liberty League? He said, America can have only one capital, Washington or Moscow, right? The fascists and Nazis of the World War II and pre-World War II years were the Rachel Maddows of the day. They were preaching Russophobia, preaching anti-communism, calling Roosevelt a dictator, calling Roosevelt a tyrant and a strong man, saying that he had come to power because of meddling and foreign influence from Russia, saying that his attempts to use the Supreme Court to support his economic measures were a threat to the republic, a threat to democracy. The people supporting Hitler in the 1930s in America, Rachel Maddow, were just like you. They sounded just like you. They were preaching Russophobia. They were preaching a call for dissent to be outlawed. They called the labor movement violent thugs who were, violently threatening the private property rights of small businesses. Rachel Maddow, if you open a history book and read what Charles Coughlin or the America First Committee or the Silver Legion of America were saying, they sounded just like you. All righty. But let's continue with our history lesson from Rachel Maddow.
There were powerful, well-connected, and indeed well-armed forces in the United States in the lead up to World War II who wanted us fighting on Hitler's side.
Wait a second. There were powerful and well-connected forces. Were they a cabal? Were they a cabal, Rachel? Were they a cabal? There was a sinister group of people that wanted us to align with Hitler. And were they pulling strings behind the scenes? Were they like a shadowy elite that was controlling the political process? Oh my God, Rachel Maddow is a Nazi, according to the definition of Nazi that she used 5 minutes earlier in her broadcast. But let's continue.
Because of what Hitler was saying about Jewish people and what he was doing to Jewish people. We had
Actually, if you read Elizabeth Dilling, one of the main promoters of Nazism in the United States, Elizabeth Dilling The reason that she was sympathetic to the Nazis wasn't because of what they were saying about Jewish people. It was because of what they were saying about communists. And if you listen to the National Association of Manufacturers and the American Legion, they actually really liked Hitler because he was killing all the communists. And Hitler then said communism was a Jewish conspiracy. But their main argument in favor and support of Hitler was that Hitler was killing all the commies. He was getting rid of those pesky labor unions that were always leading strikes. He was bringing order to the country and nullifying the threat of communist revolution. He was, he was kind of like you, Rachel. He was whipping up hysteria about the fear of foreign influence and Russia and the need to shut down dissent and silence critics who were speaking up and spreading disinformation and propaganda from the Reds. But let's continue, Rachel. Continue to lecture us about fascism.
Ultra-right movement here in America that sided with that 85 years ago. And the fight against them back then.
Like, she looks shocked, too. Like, are you really shocked that in the United States of America, the center of Western capitalism, the homeland of American imperialism, there would be people that supported a violent anti-communist movement in Germany? Like, why is that like shocking to her? Like, there was people here 85 years ago. Oh my God, good America had fascists. Of course, America had fascists in it. Of course. And in fact, the Nazis got a lot of their eugenics laws from the United States. In Mein Kampf, Hitler actually praises the eugenics laws in the United States. And you can go down the line, long before Hitler came to power, Woodrow Wilson worked with Hollywood and G.W. Griffith to make a propaganda film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan called The Birth of a Nation. And if you watch that film, it doesn't say white people in the film. What's the word in A Birth of a Nation or The Birth of a Nation? What's the word that they use in that film for white people? They call them Aryans. Aryans. And, the Ku Klux Klan was a mass fascist movement in the United States, that really started after the Civil War, but was revived in 1914. That was decades before the Nazi Party, was a big deal in Germany. There was fascism in the United States and fascist elements and extremists and violent far-right anti-communists and anti-Semites and racists. There was that in America. Why is she shocked by this? She's just so shocked that there were people in America who supported Hitler. Of course there were people in America who supported Hitler. And IBM supported Hitler, and Coca-Cola, the reason there's Fanta Orange is they wanted to have the Nazi drink. They didn't want to have the Nazis drinking Coke, but they wanted to make money from bottling soda in Nazi Germany. Hugo Boss was making the Nazi uniforms. It was many big corporations, L'Oreal from France, many big corporations were in bed with the Nazis, Rachel. That's not shocking because fascism is about saving capitalism, is an attempt to save capitalism by crushing the labor movement, crushing the unions, and degrowth. So why is she shocked by this?
I think is fascinating. And that's what I've been working on with this podcast. I think that there's a lot for us to learn from the Americans who went before us who had to fight against that.
Well, a lot of them were communists, Rachel. The main fighters against Hitler in the United States, they were communists. And in fact, during the McCarthy period, one of the categories they had for people that shouldn't be trusted, they had communists, that was members of the party. They had fellow travelers, people that weren't members of the party but were considered aligned with the communists. They had another category during McCarthyism for people that shouldn't be trusted. You know what it was? It was premature anti-fascists. Premature anti-fascists. If you were anti-fascist before World War II started, that meant you were probably a communist. You were a premature anti-fascist. That was actually a category the McCarthyists used, right? It was considered to be a category of subversive, a premature anti-fascist. So there you go, Rachel. Premature anti-fascists. So all these people that you're talking about who were fighting against fascism, a lot of them were communists. And they admired Stalin. And they admired the Soviet Union. And they were supporting the effort to defeat fascism on the part of the communists. They were part of the Communist International. But let's go on, Rachel. Please continue telling us.
But if you study this stuff in history, right, I mean, it's almost unbelievable that it happened at all when it happened. But then when you're in the middle of studying that history, you have news cycles like the one we're in right now.
Why is it unbelievable that there would be pro-Nazi people in America? Why is that unbelievable? I mean, the United States has supported every authoritarian fascist government around the world. They supported Pinochet. They supported Pol Pot in Cambodia because he was against the Soviet Union. They've supported all kinds of military juntas. They supported Rios Montt in Guatemala, who committed genocide against the native people. I mean, all kinds of brutal authoritarian regimes that killed communists were supported by America simply because they killed communists. So why is she shocked, just shocked, that the United States would have admirers and supporters of Hitler in it? Like, what planet is she living on?
And it feels all the more impossible that this is what's happening right now. I mean, in our current news cycle right now, you've got the immediate former president of the United States putting out a statement on social media.
How is it happening now? This is great. Please continue, Rachel.
That's some kind of ominous, vague warning for Americans who are Jewish, saying Jews need to be more appreciative of him. Jews need to, quote, get their act together. He says, quote, before it's too late.
Yeah, well, read that tweet. Read that tweet. It's very clear. Donald Trump is saying to Israel, look who your real friend is. Donald Trump is bragging that he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Donald Trump is warning about the danger of Muslims around the world. Donald Trump was a huge panderer to Netanyahu and the Israeli far right wing. He was completely pandering to the Israeli far right wing. And if you read the text of that tweet, read the tweet on the screen.
Nobody knows what he's talking about.
Read the tweet on the screen. He's saying basically that in order to be safe from anti-Israel and anti-Semitism, Jews need to rally behind him. That's what Donald Trump is saying because he was a very pro-Israel president. That's what he was saying. The notion that this tweet from Donald Trump is threatening another Holocaust is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. Donald Trump was a blatantly pro-Israel president, pro-Netanyahu. This tweet is not threatening another Holocaust. It's saying that Jewish folks need to rally behind him so he can protect them because he was really pro-Israel and really anti-Islamic and really anti-Iran. That's what this tweet is very clearly saying. I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, and especially not on this front. Donald Trump was an awful president. And one of the reasons I disagree with Donald Trump is because he was such a blind supporter of Israel. And he did leaps and backflips to please Israel. So this notion that Donald Trump is calling for another Holocaust or he's anti-Semitic because that tweet is just ridiculous. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous. Read the tweet. It doesn't say that. Donald Trump was the most pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, anti-Iran, anti-Islamic president ever. Netanyahu loved Donald Trump. I mean, give me a break, Rachel. Give me a break.
Or what he's threatening American Jews with here, but
you think we're stupid?
This is really happening now.
Oh, come on.
We're 3 weeks out from the next election after the last one, when he sent an armed mob of his supporters to try to violently overthrow the government.
Oh yeah, Buffalo, that guy with the buffalo horns on his head, and a couple Proud Boys who ran around and farted in Nancy Pelosi's chair. Yeah, they were going to violently overthrow the government. Yeah, I think in order to violently overthrow the U.S. government, you need like an army, you need the military. In order to overthrow the government, I think you need more than a mob of rednecks running through the Capitol. But continue.
The transfer of power and make him leader by force of arms. Last week, the Republican Party...
Force of arms. Make him leader by force of arms. Do you really think that largely unarmed crowd was going to defeat the U.S. Army? Seriously? Seriously. I mean, again, do they think we're stupid? Yes, they do. All righty.
This on social media. Kanye, Elon, Trump. The latter, of course, is the guy who just posted the Jews better get their act together message. The former is the guy who just posted that while he was sleepy right this second, as soon as he woke up, he was going to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. The middle guy in that triad is the one who has reportedly been in direct contact with the fascist dictator in Russia who's currently waging war on Ukraine.
Hold up. I'm really lost here, Rachel. All right, so Donald Trump former president of the United States who was super pro-Israel, whose daughter has converted to Judaism, right, and is an Orthodox Jew, who moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's the first one. That's Trump. The last one is Kanye West, a rapper who's made some anti-Semitic tweets and stuff like that. And the middle one is Elon Musk, who says nothing about Jews, but he's friendly with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who's currently waging a war against a group of Nazis, against people that are tearing down World War II memorials, against people that are honoring Nazi collaborators. A leader who is constantly talking about how great the victory over fascism was. You really lost me there, right? Anti-Semitic African-American rapper or rapper who made anti-Semitic tweets. Former president who was super pro-Israel, has a Jewish daughter, and was just pandering endlessly to Israel and Netanyahu. And Elon Musk, who has made statements about maybe negotiating with Russia, that's currently playing up the glory of the Soviet Union and their proud anti-fascist heritage as they battle Nazis. I don't know what the Republican Party meant by those tweets, but if you think that tweet somehow means kill all Jews, you're insane.
He's the guy who's recently been promoting an appeasement plan to get Western countries to back off and just let the Russian dictator keep whatever parts of other countries he wants to invade and occupy, and we should leave him alone to do it.
Well, actually, no. Russia facilitated this thing called the Minsk Agreement. They tried their hardest to get Ukraine to just recognize the rights of the people in the eastern regions. They bent over backwards to avoid recognizing the republics. And then after 8 years of waiting, after a food blockade, after drone strikes, after the government in Kiev threatened to get nuclear weapons, then Russia moved in to protect the people that speak Russian in the eastern regions from 8 years of bombardment. Russia's taken in millions of refugees from the Donbass regions. She doesn't know what she's talking about there. She's, and now Elon Musk wanting to negotiate an end to this war is somehow proof that he wants to kill all Jews or something. This is like there's nothing logically coherent about anything that she is saying. Has she said one true thing since the beginning of this segment? Like one true thing. I'm waiting for one true thing from the beginning of this segment to the, fascists want to burn the country down and burn the whole country down because it's irredeemable and start from the beginning with them in charge, to, Donald Trump is anti-Semitic because he's saying that he's the real supporter of Jewish people and they should support him, to Elon Musk is somehow a fascist because he wants to negotiate with Russia, which is fighting fascism. She hasn't said any true things throughout any of this segment.
So the House Republican tweet naming those three guys as the holy trinity of the Republican Party right now, Kanye, Elon, Trump, that's still up.
Yeah, and none of those people have anything to do with the point of your story here.
The before it's too late threat that the Jews need to get their act together.
Yeah, so Donald Trump can protect them. That's the point of his tweet. And that was the point of his presidency. He was endlessly pandering to Israel.
The going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people threat.
From a rapper, from an African-American rapper. I really doubt he's a white nationalist, despite, the problematic things he said and the offensive things he said about Jewish people. I really doubt that Kanye West is a white nationalist.
And also with the guy in touch with Putin, trying to get everybody else to back off and let him invade who he wants.
And what does Putin have to do with any of this? Because Putin's fighting against Nazis in Ukraine, defending World War II memorials, glorifying and playing up the history of the Soviet Union, liberating Jews from concentration camps. This has absolutely, there's not a single coherent thread here.
That's still up from an official Republican Party Twitter account. And all of this it is a good reminder that anti-Semitism and authoritarianism very, very, very often go together.
Wait, what? What? Huh?
It is also a reminder that neither of these things are fights that are consigned to history. Our generation gets our turn in the barrel with these things now.
It's like this started out as her giving us a confused lecture on the history of fascism, and it just turned into a schizophrenic rant. She's connecting things that are in no way connected. She's pointing to tweets that don't say what they actually say. She's linking Russia to things that have nothing to do with Russia. I mean, this is just incoherent. I mean, this is worse than bad analysis. Like Kanye West, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump have nothing to do with each other. I mean, they have nothing to do with each other. And she's trying to tie them all together in this elaborate global conspiracy in which there's a secret Nazi cabal that's like pulling the strings to kill all the Jews or something. But then she started out the program by saying that if you think that there is a secret cabal pulling the strings, that you're a fascist. This doesn't even make any sense.
You might have admired about Americans in the past who confronted these things in the past. Well, now's your chance to
You mean all the communists who fought fascism in the 1930s, all the people in the Communist Party that shut down the German-American Bund when they rallied in Madison Square Garden, all the people who stood up for the Scottsboro 9 against racism, the hands-off Ethiopia marches led by the Communist Party in Harlem, defending the Ethiopians against the fascist Italian invaders, the writers against war and fascism that was built by the Communist Party. So all the communists, but continue.
What they did that you think was right, whatever you might have resented or been disappointed in, and thinking about Americans in the past who didn't rise to the occasion, who stuck their heads in the sand, who pretended it wasn't happening, who let it slide. Well,
like liberals like you.
Well, now's your chance to not emulate them.
So now is our chance to be communists.
Because this is our turn with this stuff. 2.5 years ago, in the spring of 2020, as the coronavirus pandemic was just starting to rage, the White House installed a Trump campaign aide to take over the CDC. Somebody with zero public health experience, somebody with zero science experience, put that person in there to basically ride herd at the CDC. With that appointment, the CDC had to run everything through this Trump campaign aide. Anything they wanted to say to the American public about the pandemic first had to be approved by that random guy. And that included the CDC's gold standard scientific reports, which are called MMWRs, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Reports. MMWRs written by...
Okay, I'm waiting for the fascism part. We're gonna skip through this here because I'm not seeing what any of this has to do with fascism. Maybe she's done talking about fascism now. I guess maybe she's done talking about fascism. Now she's just talking about COVID and stuff
just buy
like
hearing
that.
aids over the counter.
Anyway, I just wanted you to see that. That was Rachel Maddow explaining the history of fascism and how Kanye West and Elon Musk and Donald Trump are proving that it's about to happen again. So you have to vote for the Democrats or else they're going to burn the whole country down because it's irredeemable. And I mean, that was just incoherent insanity. I mean, I don't know what to say about it. I really don't know what to say about it, but it's worth paying attention to because, again, there's probably a lot of people who watched that and thought that there was something coherent that she was saying there. They don't know the history of communist organizing and resisting fascism. They don't know any of the history there, and they didn't pay attention to what Donald Trump did while he was president or what his message around Israel was. So there you go. But I want to play another video by a liberal. Who's just as dumb as Rachel Maddow, if not dumber. But this liberal pretends to be a communist. And, I want to talk about this because this video is like a confession. This video is like a confession tape. If I was in the Communist Party USA, I would be calling up the national office and saying, take this video down, because this video is a complete confession that everything that they have ever said about me and their relentless campaign against me is a lie. That's what this video is, that they admit in this video that their relentless campaign against me is a lie. Folks, this is We Are City Builders, the Center for Political Innovation educational manual. And it contains essays that I wrote, as well as the works of Mao and Marx and Albert Einstein and others. And it actually contains a speech by President Roosevelt at the 1936 Democratic Convention or in Madison Square Garden. It's also got in it an anti-fascist speech by Henry Wallace, The Century for the Common Man, where he talks about fascism being the devil's own religion of darkness and talks about the evils of Hitler and et cetera. Now, this book is pretty inclusive. One of the things that we have in here is there's actually a section in this book that glorifies the Black Panthers, right? Right? This is on page 47. We talk about the Black Panthers and their free breakfast program and how great their free breakfast program was, right? You know, and in other parts of the book, you know, we honor the history of Arab socialism. We honor the anti-fascist struggle of the Soviet Union. We talk about the role of the Communist Party. We have a whole section quoting from W.E.B. Du Bois and others about the role of the Soviet Union in fighting racism around the world. You know, here's a picture. We have a picture of W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, the beloved African-American intellectual, meeting with Mao Zedong. You know, what else do we have in here? You know, oh, we got a mural that was painted in the Kansas State Capitol. It's hanging in the Kansas State Capitol, honoring John Brown, the great anti-slavery revolutionary. We got that, you know, and that's just in the first section. And if you continue with the book, right, we go on. We've got other sections here. You know, we've got, oh boy, we've got Franklin Roosevelt, the president who led the United States during the Second World War. We've got his speech in Madison Square Garden in 1936. We've got Henry Wallace's anti-fascist speech, The Century for the Common Man by Vice President Henry Wallace, right? Real anti-fascist speech. We freedom-loving people are on the march. You know, what does he say here? He says, Herr Tyson, the wealthy German steel man, little realized what he was doing when he gave Hitler enough money to enable him to play on the minds of the German people. The demagogue is the curse of the modern world, and all the demagogues, the worst, are those financed by well-meaning, wealthy men who sincerely believe that their wealth is likely to be safer if they can hire men with political it to change it, the signpost to lure people back into slavery. I mean, this is, you know, through the leaders of the Nazi revolution, Satan is now trying to lead the common man of the whole world back into slavery and darkness. For the stark truth is that the violence preached by the Nazis is the devil's own religion of darkness. So is the doctrine that one race or one class is hereditary superior to all other races and classes are supposed to be slaves. The belief in one Satan-inspired Führer. I mean, this is a pretty anti-fascist speech. And this book is pretty anti-fascist, right? It's pretty anti-fascist, pretty thoroughly anti-fascist. It quotes the Black Panthers, quotes leaders of the Communist Party. It quotes the Vice President of the United States, who was anti-fascist, Henry Wallace. It quotes anti-fascist leaders from around the world, W.E.B. Du Bois. However, you will find an article on the Communist Party website that quotes from this book and tries to convince people that this is a white supremacist book. Seriously, this is what the Communist Party does. An article by Chris Butters that quotes this book and ignores all of the anti-fascism and all the anti-racism, all the quotes from the Black Panthers, all the anti-fascist stuff from Henry Wall, all of that, and insists that somehow, because this book has something that sounds like a Russian intellectual who's not a fascist, somehow this book is a Nazi propaganda book. That is what they did on their website. And they claim that despite all of the anti-racism, despite all the anti-fascism, glorification of democratic struggles, despite all of that, that this is a Nazi book. The position of the Communist Party USA, according to an article on their website, not in People's Weekly World, their newspaper, on their website, written by Chris Butters, this book that I just showed you, all of those anti-fascist sections of it, all the anti-racist stuff in it, according to them, this is a Nazi book. This is a fascist book. Right? That's their position. It is on their website. And so their position, keep in mind, is that this is a Nazi book. This is a fascist book. And so based on that, we've now got a video from their leader, Joe Sims, explaining to us what fascism is. So according to the Communist Party, the definition of fascism is this book, and take it away, Joe.
Fascism is mass murder.
Who have I ever murdered, Joe? Am I engaging in mass murder?
Fascism is genocide.
Am I committing genocide?
Fascism is organized industrial torture, you know.
Organized industrial torture. This book advocates organized industrial torture?
On a broad scale. Fascism is the concentration camps. Fascism was the disappeared in Argentina. Remember that? Thousands of people murdered by the military junta. Fascism is what happened in that stadium in Chile when hundreds were massacred. And after that, they took the communists and the socialists and the Democrats, the revolutionary Democrats with a small d. And I'm one of them, by the way, a revolutionary working class Democrat. And they threw them out the windows. That's what fascism is. Fascism is going back to your home country and looking for your family and your cousins and your nephews and second cousins, third cousins, gone.
Yeah, fascism is all of those things, Joe. It is all of those things. And none of those things have anything to do with me. And in fact, a lot of those things you just mentioned, like the coup in Chile, like the coup and the military juntas in Argentina that disappeared people, the people protesting against it were people who questioned mainstream media, you fucking idiot. And the people who opposed it were people who were sympathetic to Russia, you fucking idiot. The people who blindly support mainstream media and repeat anti-Russian lies, the people who say that Stalin was worse than Hitler, they were the people who supported it, you fucking idiot. It was communists, sympathizers with the Soviet Union, sympathizers with Cuba, sympathizers with Venezuela. They were the ones who were being persecuted. The kind of people that you now call fascists and Nazis.
Murdered in the gas chambers. That's what fascism is.
That's what fascism is. So tell me, how does this book that is supporting the history of anti-racist struggles in America, that is opposing the drive toward war and degrowth, that is sticking up for the rights of working people, that is upholding the legacy of the Black Panthers, how is this book everything that you just said, you fucking lying piece of shit?
And by the way, some people are saying that the Democrats are soft fascists.
The Democrats are soft fascists. I haven't heard that one, but continue, Joe. So some people are saying the Democrats are soft fascists. I want to hear where this goes. Continue. I'm interested to hear where this goes.
Contradiction in terms. Fascism is hard. Fascism is not covert. It's open.
Ooh, wait. Fascism is not covert. It's open. So does that mean that fascism isn't if you dissect someone's book and find a bunch of secret code words and understand that they sat next to somebody who once talked to somebody who once wrote something, that they're so fascism isn't covert. So there's no secret hand signs. So there is no secret code. So there's not some secret sinister plot where you have to read things. Fascism is not covert. It's not covert. So people who disagree with you in supporting the Democrats are not covertly fascists. Your whole definition of fascism is genocide, mass murder, industrial torture. Fascism is this thing that all these U.S.-aligned regimes did, and that people that you would now label conspiracy theorists for questioning U.S. foreign policy opposed, and that people aligned with Russia opposed. That fascism is all these things done by regimes backed by the United States and covered up for by American media. And now on top of that, it's not covert. So there's not a secret handshake, secret dog whistle, secret conspiracy. It's not covert. It's blatant. Okay, continue, Joe.
And when those Nazis marched in Charlottesville talking about they will not replace us, think about what's behind that.
Well, I'll tell you what's behind that concept. What's behind that concept, Joe, is the fact that millions of working people, Black, white, Arab, Asian, Latino, are dying right now. The death rate in the United States is rising. The birth rate is decreasing. Living standards are dropping. And communists should be the ones saying that is caused by capitalism and that racial divisions and the effort to incite white people against black people, to scapegoat the immigrants. This is a plot from the capitalists. And it's our job to be saying that this sense that millions of working people of many different races and nationalities have, that they are being wiped out, that the drive and the desire of capitalism is to eliminate them, is to not give them a job, not give them a future, destroy their communities. We should be the ones telling those working people that the problem is capitalism. That's our job. And they're saying fascist slogans about great replacement because you aren't doing your job, Joe. That's why people are rallying around those fascist slogans. You're not doing your job. You're making the status quo that is making them feel attacked and destroying their lives and destroying their communities and killing their relatives with opioids and sending their relatives to prison and driving down their living standards. You're making that status quo that they hate, Joe Biden's America, you're making that synonymous with communism. So of course they hate communism. So of course they're going to take leadership from far-right forces. If we don't rally the working class to fight for their own interests, somebody else will. And you are the one making sure that working class people that feel like they're under attack, that feel like their communities and their neighborhoods are under attack, don't get class conscious, anti-racist, anti-imperialist leadership. You are the one who has made sure that fascist forces hijack the anger of the working class. You are the best friend those fascists ever had. The reason that they're chanting about replacement is because communists didn't go to them and tell them that the problem is capitalism. Communists defend the anti-Russian hysteria. Communists support tech censorship and social media and silencing dissident voices. Communists tell people that conspiracy theories and questioning the government is unacceptable. Communists, under your leadership, Joe, have become blatant defenders of the status quo. They've become nothing but blind supporters of the status quo. So, of course, in such a context, people are looking for guidance from other leadership. That's you. That's on you, Joe. That's on you. Those people that are rallying around racists should be rallying around anti-racists. They should be fighting for their communities, fighting for the working class and their communities, fighting against the big banks and corporations in the name of Marxism and an anti-racist coalition. But you've decided that's not allowed. You've decided that being a communist just means you're a blind defender of Joe Biden's America. So of course, those who are angry at the status quo, those who are angry at the system are going to take leadership from other forces. That's your doing, Joe. That's all you.
Concept, murder, genocide, concentration camps, No, we
kind of like the forces in Ukraine, that Russia is fighting against. Are they like tying people to poles? Are they burning down World War II memorials? Are they glorifying Nazi leaders in the past? Is that what they're doing? Is that what they're doing? Is that what they're doing? Well, there's that. That's true, David. That is very, very true. Good to talk to you, David. Good to see you out in Australia. Yeah. It seems like these Nazis that you're upset about, Joe, are doing all the things that the Nazis in Ukraine are also doing. And your newspaper, People's World, published an article saying that Russia was the main threat, not NATO, not the Nazis.
A friend of mine from Portugal, from the Communist Party of Portugal, the other day, after the victory of Lula, he said, "Thank you. We dodged a bullet. Never underestimate the fascist danger."
Yeah. Well, you should ask your friend from the Communist Party of Portugal, Joe. You should ask him if Donald Trump's America, where people criticized Donald Trump nonstop on television, where there were constant Donald Trump, anti-Trump protests in the street, where opposing Donald Trump was the latest trendy liberal cause that everyone was doing it, where the mainstream media was constantly rallying against Donald Trump, where Donald Trump was being accused of being a traitor because he worked for the Russians. You should ask your Portuguese friend who's actually lived under fascism if that's what it was like under fascism in Portugal, where people constantly calling the fascist government, constantly calling it a treasonous regime loyal to the Russians, where people constantly rallying and protesting against the fascist regime, where was the whole establishment united in opposing the fascist regime. I mean, come on. Come on. Yeah, never underestimate the fascist threat. Yeah, never underestimate the fascist threat. You, Joe Sims, are the best friend the fascist threat ever had. As conditions get worse in America, working people are going to want to resist and fight back. And because the Communist Party has worked overtime to make sure that leftism is synonymous with defense of the status quo, to make sure that anyone who questions U.S. foreign policy is labeled a Nazi or a white supremacist, to make sure that any populism or appeal to the broad masses of working people on the basis of solidarity rather than privilege politics and degrowth, to make sure that people who want to see economic growth in their communities and don't want to be degrown to deal with climate change, to make sure that people that are angry about the police state and tech censorship, to make sure they don't feel welcome on the left, to make sure that the left is nothing but a blind defense of the sinister fascists in the status quo who want to drive down living standards, want to set up a degrowth authoritarian state to keep their power, by making Marxism and socialism the only antidote to the downward spiral of capitalism in our time, by making that synonymous with Marxism, by making Marxism synonymous with this horrendous status quo. You are the best friends. You are the best friends that fascists ever had. You know, I mean, this guy, seriously, he really needs to read Fascism and Social Revolution by R. Palm Dudd. But I continue. Anyhow, folks, I thought I might have some fun with that. You know, I've got different stuff to react to, but we're going to do that another night. That concludes my opening remarks for tonight. So we're going to do our roll call, and then we got a load of super chats to answer, but keep the super chats rolling in. We always love to answer your questions. That's why we're here. So names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? And I'm going to start answering questions after this. Who's with us? Names and locations. We got Cleveland Pirate Alex. We got St. David's Bermuda. Nate in Chicago. Rupert in the United Kingdom. We got Ryan in California. Bradley in St. Louis. John Whitty in Houston. JT24 from Mississippi. David Fox in Bendigo, Australia. Terry in Cambridge, United Kingdom. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Colin in Greensboro. Edwin in the Philippines. Very good. Los Angeles. Joe Turgis. Keelan from Milwaukee, San Jose, Dave Nano, right? Balthazar in Oakland, Killen from Milwaukee, Ryan in Kansas City, St. George in Utah, Yada Yisrael in Chicago, Steve and Ann in Georgia, Bob Troy in New York, Red Chilean in Chile. Very, very good. Smedley Butler in Chicago, William Vance, that's on Facebook in the United Kingdom, Adam from Las Vegas. Very, very good. Good to have you. Anyone on the Rockfin, by the way? I should call it the Rockfin crowd. Oh, there you go. Anybody else? We got Micah in Las Vegas. We got Carter from Duluth, Coke from Harbor, Washington, Karelian, Republic, Russia. There we go. I wonder if Caleb forgets to call me again, Mr. Wonderful. Kieran from San Diego, India. We got Ecuador. We got John McCarthy in Chicago. Ice from Iceland. X from Iceland. Alan in Chicago. Mr. Wonderful from Kronos. What's Kronos? All right. Anybody else? Names and locations. Juancho is in Ecuador. So there you go. Anybody else? Names and locations. We love to call you out as we see you. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. We got Mao from the Mountain Story Now. Aw, that's sweet. There we go. We got Hello Caleb. All right. Is that like Hello Kitty? Hello Caleb. Fremont, California. Very, very good. Anybody else? Names and locations. Mark from Utica, New York. Welcome, Mark. Welcome. Connecticut. Welcome. Richard from Woodland, Richmond. Valen from Richmond, Virginia. Good stuff, folks. So listen, folks, before we start answering super chats, I did want to let you know that the Patreon, we are going to do a patrons only stream within the next 8 days. Within the next 8 days, we're going to do a patrons only stream. So if you want to sign up on the Patreon, please do so. We can always use support there. That would be great. The Center for Political Innovation is back in business. We just had a meeting recently. It was a great meeting, a good number of people there. We're excited. We're kind of fixing things up. We've got some plans for live events again soon, but we're taking it slow. We're gradually getting things going again, but we got some exciting plans. We just had a great meeting. So if you want to join the Center for Political Innovation, if you were a member before and you'd like to rejoin, or if you are also, if you want to join, this is your first time, you're welcome to become a CPI member. There you go. All right, Caleb, please tell the story of Mao going up and coming down the mountain. Okay, I might tell it a little differently. Mao going up and coming down the mountain. Right. But there you go. Yeah, I can explain that if you'd like. There we go. There we go. But yeah, and if anyone else has anything they want me to talk about, by all means do so. That's why we're here. So first question was about Marx on de Tocqueville. It's funny. I actually don't know about Marx on de Tocqueville. I know Alex de Tocqueville. Alex de Tocqueville was a French intellectual who went to the United States, and he wrote Democracy in America, a study of the American system, which was widely read in France. And it's considered in American political science, you read Democracy in America, Alex de Tocqueville, you read that endlessly. It is, Americans love it. It is, he was a French guy, and he went to the United States, and he was just in awe of our elections and everything. And in college, I studied political science, so I read Alex de Tocqueville endlessly, right? That said, I don't know what Karl Marx said about Alex de Tocqueville, so I can't comment on that. I didn't know that Marx had commented on him, but it doesn't surprise me. He was a very prominent political scientist at the time, and his study of democracy in America is something that I had, shoved down my throat as a political science student. He talked about, you would never have a violent revolution in America because of the elections and the two-party system. He talked about how religion was really important in the United States, and that while we had a secular government, we had a highly religious population. What else did Alex de Tocqueville say? I mean, it was a study of democracy in America. He talked about the hard work and the hard work American culture. Americans love that, right? It's one of those things that the American political establishment really likes to hold up as, look, this French guy came to the United States like right after the American Revolution or in the early 1800s or something like that. And he wrote glowing things about the American political system. But as far as Marx, I didn't know that Marx had commented on him. It doesn't surprise me, but I actually don't remember what Marx said. So there you go. Next question. How is the Saudi Arabia's economy set up? Is it state-controlled capitalism? Yeah, I've argued that many times, that Saudi Arabia's economy is a great example of state-controlled or state capitalism, right? The royal family owns the entire country. Basically everything in the country is the property of the royal family. The king is the head of the country. Everyone in the country is his subject. And they sell their oil, and they bring in lots of money. And the Saudi oil company sells oil on the international markets. The Saudi royal family gets revenue. That revenue is different. Different people in the royal family get subsidies. You get a share of the oil if you're a member of the royal family, or if you're like just a Saudi citizen, you get something. You get like a stipend or something. The Shia Muslims of Saudi Arabia are second-class citizens. They're not allowed to, basically they're not allowed to practice their religion. They're taught in school that Shia Islam is a Jewish conspiracy against the king. They're only allowed to work in jobs that have manual labor. So the oil workers, the workers who do the manual labor in the oil fields, are Shia Muslims, and they have very little rights. They're heavily suppressed, and every so often they'll cut the head off of one of the Shia clerics. Ayatollah Namir al-Namir, who was one of the most prominent civil rights activists for Shia Muslims in Saudi Arabia, had his head cut off. A number of Shia Muslim political activists and others have been beheaded. That routinely happens. On top of that, 1 in 3 people in Saudi Arabia is a guest worker slave. And, if you go to Saudi Arabia, a lot of times people from Bangladesh go to Saudi Arabia. A lot of times Africans go to Saudi Arabia. A lot of times people from the Philippines go to Saudi Arabia. A lot of times people from Malaysia will go to Saudi Arabia. When they get there, you hand your passport over to the family that's hired you, and you're a slave, basically. You have no rights whatsoever. You don't have a right to freedom of speech. You don't have a right to freedom of assembly. And guest worker slaves basically get their heads cut off all the time. So yeah, if you're a Saudi citizen and you're not a Shia Muslim, and especially if you've got royal blood, if you're somehow in the royal family, you're doing pretty well, right? You get your oil subsidy, you get some privilege or whatever. If you're Saudi, but you're a Shia Muslim, well, you're only allowed to work in manual labor, and your religious rights are being persecuted. And if you're not from Saudi Arabia, you're a guest worker, you are a slave. You are basically a slave. You have no rights whatsoever. That's Saudi Arabia. Not much economic development. One thing that's interesting is they live in tents in Saudi Arabia, but those tents are very high tech, right? They're not just like little tents in the middle. It's not like a tent that's just big enough to sleep in. I mean, they have tents like the size of houses. But as part of their Bedouin culture, as an honor of their history, they live in tents. They eat camels in Saudi Arabia. Camels are considered to be, can be a very honorable food. One time I was on a plane back from the Middle East, and there was a guy from India who was an engineer. And he was telling me how great Saudi Arabia was. He was flying back to the United States from Saudi Arabia, and he was telling me how great it was. And he said, "Oh, it's so great." He said, "The first night when you come to stay at a Saudi's house to celebrate you coming, they kill a camel and you eat a camel." And so there you go, right? And then camel meat is very fatty. Those humps on the camel, those are all full of fat. And so camel meat, I've never had camel meat, but apparently the meat of a camel is apparently very good. It's very tender. I didn't realize that. I've never eaten camel. What else is there to say about Saudi Arabia? Yeah, I mean, it's very much, state-controlled capitalism. For example, the Bin Laden family, right? We know about Osama bin Laden, right? Well, he is the heir of the company, the private for-profit company that has a state monopoly on construction. Basically, all construction in Saudi Arabia is done by the Bin Laden company. And they're billionaires many times over because of the fact that they have a virtual monopoly on construction and the construction business in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family has kind of granted it to them. Wild stories about Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, and this is pretty wild, your social status is based on your license plate number. This is wild. I didn't know about this, but your license plate number is your social status. The number 1, license plate 1, belongs to the king. And the lower your license plate number is, the more important you are as a person. And so in Saudi Arabia, they will have bidding contests where people will bid millions of dollars to get a license plate with a low number, like 20 or 30 or 100 or 400, right? The lower your license plate number on your car is, the more important your social status is in Saudi Arabia. It's pretty wild. And so Saudis are known to spend millions and millions of dollars on making sure that they have a low number on their car license plate. That's a really common thing in Saudi Arabia, right? And that, there's recently been a crackdown. Now, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's really in charge. I mean, the king is a very old man, but it's the Crown Prince, his son, who's really in charge. He's been realizing that, being an oil plantation for America and the British Empire is not the most promising future for the country. So he's trying his hardest to try and fix the economy and get Saudi Arabia to have a more diverse economy. And he's put forward all kinds of different proposals about how to make Saudi Arabia's economy more diverse, flying cars and robot dinosaurs. And it's all really, really crazy. And he wants to build like a computer industrial park in Saudi Arabia. And, he's got all kinds of different ideas about how to make Saudi Arabia more diverse. And he's been cracking down on dissident wings of the royal family. There's a Hyatt hotel in Riyadh right? It's like a Hyatt hotel. And a couple years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, they turned that hotel into a temporary detention facility. And members of the royal family who were, speaking out or were criticizing his policies or were doing illegal things with their money were being rounded up and taken to this luxury hotel. I mean, it's a nice hotel, apparently. They just weren't allowed to leave. And then the police and the secret services in the country would torture them and such. And, people would just kind of disappear into that hotel for a few months. And then some of them got out and learned their lesson. And some of them then got their heads cut off. Saudi Arabia is your typical Bonapartist regime, right? There is a royal family that has seized power, and it's in a crisis right now because of the fact that oil is not the future, right? With hydraulic fracking, they're not as important to the United States as they once were. And on top of that, Saudi Arabia, because oil is all they've got, Saudi Arabia has to negotiate oil prices with Russia, right? They have to. They have to negotiate oil prices with Russia. Their oil output, how much they put out, has a huge impact on the oil markets. So the king of Saudi Arabia and Putin have to talk about oil production. So Saudi Arabia, even though the Saudi leaders tend to be sympathetic to the United States, and even though the United States props them up militarily and sells them all kinds of weapons so they can bomb the shit out of Yemen, even though that's the case, Saudi Arabia, oil is their thing. So, Russia is a leading oil producer. So is Saudi Arabia. So the king of Saudi Arabia has to call up Russia and negotiate with Russia about oil production drops and decreases and increases and stuff. Right. And because of that, Saudi Arabia can't just completely throw Russia under the bus the way the United States wants them to. The United States is really angry with Saudi Arabia right now because of the fact that Saudi Arabia is not agreeing to just completely go along with the anti-Russian crusade America is pushing. Why? Because they need to negotiate oil output with Russia, right? This is an important thing, right? Oil prices are a huge deal in Russia. It's a huge deal in Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudi king and the Saudi crown prince has to be able to get Putin on the phone and negotiate with them. And if they can't do that, then they're going to have a problem. So that's an important thing to be aware of. And occasionally you'll hear stuff. You'll hear like, oh, Russia is propping up Saudi Arabia. No. Russia's not propping up Saudi Arabia. Russia is an oil exporting country. So is Saudi Arabia. And Russia has to have an economic relationship. They have to negotiate because if that oil price goes up, if it goes down, huge impact on Russia's economy. Huge impact on Saudi Arabia's economy. So it makes sense that Russia and Saudi Arabia have a relationship. It also makes sense that Saudi Arabia is not going to go all in against Russia the way America wants it to. Now, Joe Biden said he was going to end the war in Yemen, but he hasn't done it. And he said, I'm going to cut off all the offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia and only give them defensive weapons. Well, what's the difference between an offensive gun and a defensive gun? I'll give you a hint. There isn't one. What's the difference between an offensive tank and a defensive tank? I'll give you a hint. There isn't one. It was just a made up stupid thing that Joe Biden said. We're only going to give them defensive weapons, and Joe Biden, the whole world knows that what the Saudis are doing in Yemen is criminal. They're bombing hospitals. They're bombing schools. They're creating a crisis of malnutrition. They're committing horrendous atrocities in Yemen, their neighbor. But they get away with it. Why? Because they're Saudi Arabia. They're Wall Street's oil plantation. It's Wall Street's oil slave plantation. 1/3 of the country are guest workers, slaves. They've got oil that's under the control of ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. And so because of that, they're able to continue bombing the shit out of their neighbors in Yemen and murdering Yemenis around the clock. The Saudis tried to kill me, folks. The Saudis actually tried to kill me. I was on a boat with the Red Crescent Society of Iran, and the day we were supposed to arrive in the port of Hodeidah, the Saudis bombed the port 8 times in a single day and murdered dock workers and people at the port just to keep the ship I was on from arriving at the port of Hodeidah. So, yeah, the Saudis, it's a little personal. Those folks want to kill me. They really want to kill me. And on top of the bombing, on top of the fact that they bombed the port 8 times in a single day, they had Sudanese mercenaries positioned around the port with rocket launchers, and they were ready to open fire on the port when we arrived. Now, luckily, our ship was delayed and we heard about the port being bombed, so we didn't port at Hodeidah, and we ended up turning the ship around and going to Djibouti. I ended up getting off the ship in Djibouti. But yeah, I've seen, and in Djibouti, I stood in line with all kinds of Yemeni refugees who had gotten on rafts and gotten on little tiny boats and gotten across the Gulf of Aden and gotten out of Yemen, where the Saudis were bombing the place and killing the place and slaughtering people, gotten out of Yemen and gotten to Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. And I saw whole families that were refugees that were fleeing the horrendous crimes that Saudi Arabia was committing. Saudi Arabia has the 4th largest military budget of any country in the world. And right now they are bombing the shit out of one of the poorest countries on earth, Yemen, because Yemen wants to be independent. Yemen wants to be an independent country. It wants to control its own oil resources. And because of that, the Saudis have been bombing the hell out of it and killing people and starving people there. So yeah. I mean, I don't know. What do you want to know about Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia is a Bonapartist regime. I will mention this, right? The House of Saud, that's the ruling family of Saudi Arabia. The House of Saud, they were selected by the British Empire to be the rulers of Saudi Arabia. It was the British who picked them. You read the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the borders of the modern Middle East are drawn up, right? It was the Bolsheviks who leaked it, right? It was a secret treaty among the Allied powers in World War I. Russia, the United States, Britain, France. During World War I, they drew up the borders of the Middle East, and they agreed on what country, what would be where. And Syria was here, and Jordan was here, and Iraq was here, and they divided up the Middle East. And the British are the ones that picked Saudi Arabia, and they gave it to the House of Saud, the Wahhabis. The Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, they believe in an interpretation of Islam called Wahhabism. They believe in fundamentalist Islam, and they believe you should have an autocratic monarchy. They basically believe you should do everything exactly as it was done in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Everything should be done exactly as it was done during those times, including having an autocratic monarchy and not having an elected government. And that's Saudi Arabia. It's a brutal authoritarian state propped up by the West. And right now it's having a bit of a crisis because it has to negotiate with Russia around the oil prices, because it realizes that the West doesn't need them as they once did. And so there's some, there's trouble in paradise. Their relationship with the United States is not as solid as it once was. That's Saudi Arabia. Next question. All right. Did Dugin call for a coup against Putin? Well, first of all, I doubt it. I highly doubt it. I would really highly doubt that at a time of war, when the country, Russia is fighting, on its borders against, the Ukrainians who want to destroy them, want to get nuclear weapons and have been threatening them. I really doubt that a respected Russian intellectual like Alexander Dugin would, in the middle of such a crisis, come out and say, oh, by the way, I think the president should be violently overthrown. I really doubt that he said that. But then again, what do I know? Folks, let me clue you in on something. I met with Alexander Dugin once in my entire life. Once. I have met him once, right? I mean, Dugin does not call me on the phone every day to give me orders. I have met him one time in my entire life. I have not been following his work lately. I heard about his daughter being killed, and that was a horrendous tragedy. And I met his daughter multiple times, and, she did not deserve to die. She was a good person. She loved her country. She loved Russia. And I was horrified to hear what happened to his daughter. But other than that, it's like I'm not getting a daily Dugin digest in my email. So, I don't keep up with him very regularly. So, based on a super chat I just got, someone asked me, did Dugin call for the overthrow of Putin? I highly doubt it. But I don't know. I don't follow his work. I would highly doubt he would call for such a thing, but lately I haven't been in touch with much of his work. So there you go. That's a strange question, but never say never. Maybe there's something I'm missing here or something. I haven't been following it that closely. I did follow the murder of his daughter, which was cowardly and horrendous. And I will say the fact that the Communist Party supported that right? And that they were, all these Communist Party members were cheering for the death, the brutal murder of Dugan's daughter. The fact that Ben Norton celebrated the murder of Dugan's daughter. I mean, you know, it's like, okay, there's a guy in Russia who wrote some books that you disagree with. So Ukrainian Nazis aligned with the United States murder his daughter. And that's okay because, you know, that's sickening. It's utterly sickening. How they responded to the murder of Dugan's daughter. I mean, it's utterly, utterly sickening. And if you have any doubt that there are some vile, satanic, evil people on the synthetic left, that should be the proof of it. You know, that should be the proof of it. Right? So there you go. All right. Can you explain Russia's overall military strategy in Ukraine? Look, I think that Russia very much wants to secure the regions of Ukraine that have declared independence and voted to join with Russia. I don't think that Russia wants to conquer all of Ukraine. That's ridiculous. I don't think that Russia wants to continue this war. I think Russia wants to negotiate a peace. Russia, you know, they held off for 8 years from trying to intervene in Ukraine. They were forced into it. They were forced into a situation where they had no choice but to do so. And it's costing Russia a lot in terms of money and you know, human life and such. And Russia, they have no choice. They have to move in and protect those people. But at the same time, I don't think Russia is trying. I mean, I don't think they want to keep this going for much longer. They want to negotiate. They really want to negotiate. And it seems like there are people now within the U.S. state apparatus who also want that. And I'm hoping that negotiations will move forward and some kind of agreement can be reached where the people in the eastern regions can keep their autonomy, can remain part of Russia, and you know, Russia can de-escalate this whole thing. You know, and I'm hoping that that's the case. But you know, I don't think Russia's going to abandon those folks. They're not going to let those folks be killed anymore. I mean, they waited for 8 years to intervene, and now they're moving in. I mean, they're not going to allow the Ukrainian fascist government to just keep bombing and torturing. And look at what they're doing, the Ukrainian military, in the areas that they take, where they tie these people to posts and they torture them, the summary executions. Look at what they're doing. I can't show it on this stream because it would violate YouTube's standards, but they do horrendous things they've been doing. So just look into the details. You know, mainstream media covers up for the Ukrainian Nazis like crazy, but they do horrendous things. Now, this person said their impression is that the German economy flourished. Is that true? Very good question. The German economy under Hitler did very, very well in the first few years because of the fact that Hitler engaged in very dramatic Bonapartist moves to stabilize the economy, right? So Germany, its economy had been miserable. There'd been mass unemployment. There'd been mass debt. You know, their currency was facing all kinds of inflation. The Nazis took power. And they seized power. What happened was there was an election. They won as part of a coalition. Hitler was then appointed chancellor, even though his party was not the biggest party in the right-wing coalition. And then the Reichstag was burned. And they declared a state of emergency. And in the state of emergency, they removed all the communists from the parliament, and their seats were taken by Nazis. And so they suddenly had a supermajority. And because they had a supermajority, then the Nazis were able to basically set up a new government, an authoritarian state. Once the Nazis established their authoritarian state, they did a number of very dramatic things. First thing they did is they broke the labor movement. All the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, all the leaders of the Communist Party were rounded up and put in prison camps. And that had the effect of reducing unemployment because all those people were no longer competing for jobs because they were in prison camps. On top of that, a lot of people got jobs building the concentration camps and prison camps. On top of that, a lot of other people got jobs being guards in those prison camps. Next thing the Nazis did is they built some highways across Germany, the Autobahns, these highways that go straight across Germany, the Autobahns. So they built those Autobahn highways, put a lot of people to work building those highways. Next thing they did is they repudiated the Treaty of Versailles, and they allowed the German economy to start military spending again. And they started building tanks and bombs and weapons. The Treaty of Versailles had said that Germany wasn't allowed to have a military. Well, Germany restarted military spending, and all kinds of Germans got jobs working in military armaments factories, etc. On top of that, a lot of German companies got free labor from the concentration camp inmates. Volkswagen and all BMW and all kinds of companies got free labor from those prisoners, those communists and social democrats that were thrown into the prison camps. On top of that, what did the Nazis do to stabilize the economy? On top of that, they canceled the debt to American and British banks. They ripped up, they owed American banks and British banks huge amounts of money, and they refused to pay it. And Hjalmar Schacht, who was the big wealthy banker, who was Hitler's big finance backer, Hjalmar Schacht met with Roosevelt and told Roosevelt, we're not going to pay back our loans from American banks. And Roosevelt laughed about it. And he said, well, it serves those Wall Street guys right. Roosevelt actually thought it was kind of funny and thought it was hilarious that Germany wasn't going to pay back its loans. And he was kind of impressed with the boldness of the Nazis to just refuse to pay back money they owed to some of the wealthiest banks in the world. So they canceled the debts, they built the Autobahns, they restarted military spending, they put a huge chunk of the country in concentration camps and used the concentration camp prisoners to subsidize corporations with free labor. By doing that, they stabilized the economy. And for the next 2-3 years, from about 1933 to about 1936 or 37, the Nazi regime experienced a fair amount of economic strength because they drastically reduced unemployment, created full employment, and they drastically turned on the spigots of government spending. There was a huge amount of spending. And it was that economic boom, that burst that they had in the first 3 years, that kind of economic boom, that explosion that they created with degrowth methods. That's what enabled them to create a totalitarian state. A lot of people that had been kind of on the fence about them, they never had a clear majority. They were never elected with a majority. A lot of people that were on the fence about them, all of a sudden, when they went from having a very bad economy to all of a sudden wages were up again and there was full employment, a lot of people came over to their side after that. And that's one of the dirty secrets of Bonapartism. Every authoritarian government, every authoritarian regime, if you have a heavy-handed military state, you generally have to have at least one section of the population that strongly benefits from it. And this is the Bonapartist degrowth method by creating an underclass of concentration camp inmates, right? By creating that underclass and using their slave labor for the economy, by spending lots of money on militarism, they were able to reboot the economy. Now, it didn't last very long. 1937, 38, Nazi Germany was starting to have big economic problems. And World War II broke out. The reason that the Nazis started expanding rapidly and seizing territory and all of that was because their economy was about to collapse, right? Their economy was so centered on war. And if you're not having a war, right? If you're not actually having a war, you can only build so many extra tanks and bombs and airplanes and all of that without having an all-out war. And basically, the German economy was starting to creak and moan. And so they started moving toward having an all-out war. And World War II was done out of necessity as the artificial degrowth stimulant methods used to stabilize the German economy as they ran out. And in fact, there's actually a very good section on Nazi economics in the book Dialectical Economy by Lynn Marcus. Lyndon LaRouche, he went under the pen name Lynn Marcus. And it's his book on Marxist economics. There's a section about Nazi economics that's very, very good, where he points to how Nazi economics operated, what was driving the Third Reich, and that basically, the Nazi regime used artificial degrowth methods very swiftly and very dramatically, which they pushed through by establishing an authoritarian state and imprisoning all kinds of people to push, to artificially create an economic boom. And they created an underclass of slave laborers, and they started also kind of pulling it out of different sections of the population, and they stabilized the economy. And it's worth paying attention to, because that's basically those methods of degrowth, right? Of creating an underclass of slave laborers, driving down the population, using fascism and driving toward war to save the economy. That's what the capitalists of our time are doing. That's what neoliberal Western capitalism in our time is talking very openly about doing. They're doing it under a different banner. They're not talking about the Aryan race and the German nation, etc. No, they're talking about it under very different auspices. But the climate, the climate hysteria, the people throwing chicken soup or tomato soup on paintings, and the people hysterically pushing against Russia and for tech censorship. The woke agenda, if you look at it in its essence, is a fascist economic agenda. Fascism is about trying to stabilize capitalism by driving down living conditions for a big chunk of the population, by decreasing the population, by reducing consumption in order to stabilize capitalism. And that's what these folks want to do. They want a highly mechanized and controlled capitalism that will drive down living standards. And if you look at what the synthetic left wants, they have a very clear agenda, right? They call it socialism, but it's not. They don't believe in a centrally planned economy. They don't believe in public ownership of the means of production. They believe in worker cooperatives. And who are the biggest, supporters of the synthetic left, right? It's Silicon Valley. It's Jeff Bezos. It's the big oil, the Ford Foundation, and all of that. So imagine an America where there's an absolute monopoly by the biggest corporations, Amazon and Walmart and Google and Facebook have absolute hegemony. All small businesses have been wiped out, and everyone works at one of these huge mega corporations. However, when they work at this huge mega corporation, they work at, they're technically a co-owner because it's a cooperative. They get a share of the profits. They don't get wages. They don't get a set paycheck. They get a share of the profits. They're co-owners of a cooperatives. That's what it would be, right? And that's very similar to what Mussolini did in Italy with the corporate state, right? Where it was still a for-profit corporation, but there was this entity called the corporate, where the fascist party and the fascist labor union and the owner, they worked together and they all owned the company together. In Spain, they had a similar model they called national syndicalism, right? Worker ownership, that's syndicalism. And that fascists always have a weird scheme that seems socialistic, where there's like worker representation, the workers and the capitalists come together, except somehow profits are still in command. And somehow the millionaires and billionaires who own the big corporations still end up owning them. But it's somehow socialistic or something. Fascists always do that. And that's what the synthetic left wants to do. Meanwhile, they want to drive down the birth rate. Meanwhile, they want to punish anyone who dissents. So imagine in this high-tech world that they're trying to create, where everyone's a co-owner working at a huge monopoly corporation, where you don't get a wage, you just get a share of the, get a stock dividend instead of a wage because you're a co-owner, but you're basically a slave anyway. And then on top of that, imagine that if anyone says anything dissenting, society boycotts them immediately. You lose your job. You lose the ability to do business anywhere. No one can sell you any products. Your landlord throws you out on the street. Society boycotts you if you have a dissident view. So all dissident views are wiped out, are boycotted. You get automatically canceled. No one in society can touch you if you have a dissident view, right? You immediately get canceled. You lose your job. Your landlord kicks you out on the street. No store will sell you any products. Society kicks you out. If you have a dissident view, if you question the prevailing narrative, you're spreading disinformation, you're promoting conspiracy theories, you're out on the street, right? And then the icing on the cake is that everyone is being told that it is their job to have an all-out war with Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran, and that while working at one of these ultra corporations and not getting a real wage and just getting a share as a co-owner, and while not being able to dissent, and any dissent is met with immediate blacklisting by society, add into that that on top of that, while you're on the job at this company, you're constantly being mobilized to support war against anti-imperialist countries, because, the USA is spreading human rights and freedom and Western ideals all over the world. And so part of being a loyal citizen or a good employee of the cooperative that you work for is that you must engage in activism to spread war all over the world. This is the high-tech dark ages that they want. And while this is going on, they're actively driving down living standards. People get punished for having children. People are punished if they consume too many resources. There's a constant effort to get people to accept lower and lower living conditions, a constant effort to drive down the population. Everyone's being, of course, psychologically programmed and brainwashed by their phones. That is the high-tech dark ages that the wokes are fighting for. This is more or less the woke agenda. And it sounds a lot like fascism to me. I mean, it's funny because if you watch 1984, the film made in 1984 based on George Orwell's famous novel, the world in that film is supposed to be an anti-communist caricature. But it sounds a lot like what the wokes want. They want a high-tech world where everyone's constantly being monitored to make sure that they're not, a racist, sexist, homophobic, fascist, conspiracy theorist, dissident. That's one thing. They want this highly mechanized and controlled capitalism that pretends to be worker ownership, but you're really working for the profits of the rich. They want, the population to be constantly mobilized in activism, which is to beat back countries like Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. They want to create this scary degrowth totalitarian state. That's what they want to do. That's the Silicon Valley fascist blueprint that they've laid out for us. And it's scary as hell. And it has nothing to do with socialism. Nothing to do with socialism. It's utterly terrifying. And it's very similar to what the Nazis did, except it doesn't have Nazi ideology. They're not preaching racism. They're preaching anti-racism. They're not preaching, the glory of Germany. Instead, they're preaching globalism and internationalism, right? The bells and whistles, the ideological window dressing is different, but the aim is the same. Stabilize capitalism by having the government and the corporations team up, drive down the living standards, wipe out all dissent, and mobilize for all-out war. That is basically the fascist agenda, and that is what the wokes want to do. That is what they want to do. The woke agenda, the MSNBC, CNN, breadtube agenda, that's what they want, and it sounds very fascistic. In its economic essence, it's fascistic. All right, next question. If anyone has any other questions, by all means, shoot them my way. All right, the FTX crypto scandal and Ukraine connections. I just don't know enough about it at this point. I've seen some stuff about it, but I need to do more research before I comment on that. I'm sorry, I can't talk out of my ass on here. It is my responsibility to do my best to give you accurate information, and I just have not done enough research on the scandal in order to give you accurate information in my analysis. So I can't comment on it at this time. I apologize. I hope in future streams to give you a presentation on it. Austrian and Portuguese fascism. Well, in Austria, there was a fascist government, a fascist nationalist political party that took power, that was against communists and such. And then they ultimately enabled and allowed the Nazis to absorb Austria into Germany. The position of the Nazis was that Austria and Germany were the same nationality. Hitler in Mein Kampf raved against the Habsburg monarchy. Hitler was born in Austria, not in Germany, so it was kind of a defensive thing. Was he actually a German? Well, he was born in Austria, and he took the position that Austrians were Germans. And so, yeah, the government in Austria that was elected, that had Nazi sympathizing fascist elements in it, enabled the Nazis to absorb Austria. Portuguese fascism. Well, the Portuguese fascist junta that collapsed, I believe it was overthrown in 1975. That was very much, it had worked with Franco in Spain. It was a totally different country. Portugal and Spain are completely different countries, different language, but it was a 1930s authoritarian Bonapartist government. And I believe they were neutral in the Second World War, much like Franco's Spain. That's my understanding, at least. And now Portugal is a pretty progressive place. The Communist Party is part of the coalition government in Portugal. The death penalty has been gotten rid of. There's strong welfare state in Portugal now, and that Portugal, in a lot of ways, has held on to its welfare state, which is interesting. In 1975, the fascist government of Portugal fell. The colonies of Portugal, like Angola, were granted independence. And my understanding is that Portugal is now a pretty moderate and progressive place by such standards. But there you go. All right. right. Stalin said that the Churchill gang killed FDR and his son. That makes sense to me. I get suspicious of deaths when they happen at very convenient times. You know, people die, right? Everyone dies eventually. Death happens. So just death in and of itself is not suspicious. What's suspicious is when someone dies at a time that is extremely convenient for certain people. And the reason that I think Stalin probably asked that question about Roosevelt's death was it was extremely well timed. All right, World War II was coming to an end. It wasn't over yet. Roosevelt wanted to continue an alliance with the Soviet Union. He wanted to enact an economic Bill of Rights. He was moving in a left-wing direction. U.S. imperialism, on the other hand, was moving toward the Cold War, and they wanted to start setting up to have an all-out Cold War with the Soviet Union. So, under such circumstances, they needed to get rid of Roosevelt. And Truman was from the right wing of the Democratic Party. He was a Dixiecrat. He had been in the Ku Klux Klan briefly. He quit the Ku Klux Klan because they wouldn't let him hire Roman Catholics for government jobs. I think it's hilarious, right? You know, I mean, it's just like, of all the reasons to quit the Ku Klux Klan, it's like, this is a group that dangles black men from trees and mutilates their bodies and lights them on fire. You know, and it's like, well, they wouldn't let me hire Catholics. I mean, what the hell is that? I mean, it's just like, oh, okay. All right. Well, there you go. You know, you got to draw the line somewhere. I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, Truman was an awful racist in so many ways. But yeah, Harry Truman had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan when he was a politician in St. Louis, Missouri. Then, you know, he found out that he couldn't hire any Roman Catholics to work at government jobs. So he quit the Ku Klux Klan. He was a one-time Klansman. He quit the Klan. He was a Democrat, and he rose to prominence in the Democratic Party by investigating the New Deal for corruption. And he was a critic of the Roosevelt administration. And in the lead up to World War II, he gave a speech on the floor of Congress and said that if it looked like Stalin and the Soviet Union were going to win the Second World War, the USA should back Hitler. And if it looked like Hitler was going to win the Second World War, the USA should back Stalin in the hopes that both Hitler and Stalin would weaken each other and the United States could become the dominant power. He actually gave a speech on the floor of Congress saying that the USA should support whichever side was losing in World War II in order to make Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union fight each other and weaken both. That is what he said on the floor of Congress. Now, if you want to talk about somebody who's not qualified to be president of the United States, that's Harry Truman. And Harry Truman, you know, Henry Wallace was the vice president for most of World War II, but 1944 election, Roosevelt was forced by the Democratic Party to remove Henry Wallace and replace Henry Wallace with Harry Truman, who was from the right wing of his party. And then Harry Truman, it's noted, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was totally militarily unnecessary. Japan offered to surrender. The USA said no. It dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and then accepted the exact same deal afterwards, meaning that it was purely they just wanted to drop the bombs. They wanted to send a message to the Soviet Union that they had the atomic bomb. They wanted to test the atomic bomb, basically. Totally unnecessary. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was absolutely unnecessary. Absolutely unnecessary. And then Harry Truman also created Israel. And many people have pointed out that if Roosevelt had lived, Israel would never have been created. And in fact, David Niles, who worked in the White House, said that. He said basically Roosevelt was not interested in creating Israel. And that many rabbis and Zionists and others had met with Roosevelt about creating Israel. And he said, nope, not interested. And Truman, on the other hand, he was the president who went ahead with the creation of Israel. And, you know, there's a story of Truman. He was speaking at a Jewish community event once, and a rabbi introduced Harry Truman, and they said, this is the man who helped to create Israel. And as soon as he got up to the podium, Harry Truman said, what do you mean helped to create? I am Cyrus. And of course, that's a reference to the Iranian king, the Persian king Cyrus, who rescued the Jews. So he, you know, Truman was so proud of having created Israel. He said, I am Cyrus. And the wild thing is that Truman, yes, he created Israel. He went ahead. He was, he recognized Israel. He voted at the UN for the creation of Israel. But what's ironic is that Harry Truman was wildly anti-Semitic. In his personal diaries, he said awful things about Jews. He hated Jews. He had utter contempt for Jewish people, but he created Israel. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was the president who was constantly trying to warn people about the dangers of the Nazis, was constantly trying to override Congress and allow more Jewish refugees into the United States to escape the Nazi gas chambers. Roosevelt, he appointed Henry Morgenthau to be the Secretary of Treasury, and that was very, very important to appoint a Jewish person to that high level of government back in those days when there was so much anti-Semitism. Roosevelt was widely loved by the American Jewish community. And Truman, on the other hand, was pretty anti-Semitic and such, but, the history has been rewritten. The Holocaust Museum in DC works really, really hard to convince people that Roosevelt was an evil anti-Semite. The Jerusalem Post attacked Obama simply for quoting Roosevelt, saying that Roosevelt was somehow an anti-Semite. Meanwhile, Truman, who wrote awful things about Jews and was at one point a Ku Klux Klan member, Truman gets honored, as a great friend of the Jewish people because he helped to create Israel. And that shows that the Zionist political interpretation and actual concern about anti-Semitism don't walk hand in hand, right? Roosevelt, defeated Hitler, led the anti-fascist alliance, appointed Henry Morgenthau, U.S. Secretary of Treasury, was loved by American Jews, but was anti-Israel. So he's considered to be a rotten anti-Semite, even though he was a great anti-fascist, etc. Meanwhile, Harry Truman, who was a member at one point of the Ku Klux Klan, who said nasty, contemptuous, hateful things about Jews, he's loved because he created Israel. So, there you go. That should tell you that it's not really concerns about opposing anti-Semitism. It's not really concerns about the best interests of the Jewish people that drives Israel. Israel has its own political agenda. Hannah Arendt, who was a CIA-linked writer who, she wrote her stuff on totalitarianism and stuff. She wrote a lot of awful stuff I don't agree with that I'm very critical of. However, Hannah Arendt did a very good expose of Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. And she exposed that a lot of Zionists were very sympathetic to Hitler because they thought Hitler would create a situation where Jews had to move to Israel. Right? They thought that Hitler would help the agenda of creating Israel and would negotiate, land deals, would deport all the Jews to Palestine, etc. And that while the Marxist and communist wing of the Jewish community was much more anti-fascist, and there was a whole organization among Jewish settlers in Palestine, Irgun. The Irgun organization. This was an armed group of what they called revisionist Zionists that were very sympathetic to the Nazis. And they basically said, look, the Nazis are anti-Semitic. Well, that's because they're Germans and, they're fighting for the Germans. We're fighting for the Jews. And maybe it'll be great that the Germans will kick the Jews out of Germany, and then they'll come here and we can set up Israel, a Jewish state, etc. This is all historical fact. And if you point out any of this, right? If you point out any of this, people immediately call you anti-Semitic. And it's like, no, we're pointing out the history that while the Israeli Labor Party and Haganah, they supported the British and they were anti-fascist. That's true. Irgun, the rival, the revisionist party, and Irgun, they took the opposite position. And Hannah Arendt has written a great amount about, Zionist collaboration with the Nazis, etc. And they went after, I think, the former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. He pointed this out. This is a historical fact. He pointed this out, and they went after him like crazy in Britain. The Labor Party and all of them. Oh my God, anti-Semitism. How can he say it? It's like, it's true. It's actually true, right? Just like IBM collaborated with the Nazis, just like Henry Ford collaborated with the Nazis. There were Zionist elements in the Jewish community that were not the majority. Until the Holocaust, the majority of Jews in the world were socialists or social democrats or anarchists or communists, right? Zionism was the minority. It wasn't until after the Second World War that Zionism got the majority in the Jewish community. But, there were Zionists in the Jewish community that were sympathetic to the Nazis, that negotiated deals with the Nazis. This is historical fact. This is historical fact, and no one wants to talk about this. Interesting bit of information. Ken Livingston, he was the mayor of London. Ken Livingston, and he was the mayor of London, and he has actually endorsed this book, which I read. I found it to be rather interesting. It's a biography of Jerry Healy. Jerry Healy was a British Trotskyist leader who was a personal friend of Gaddafi. And he led the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And they were a Trotskyist group in Britain, a very big Trotskyist group. They had a daily newspaper called the Newsline, and they were pro-Palestine long before that was trendy. In the 70s and 80s, they made pro-Palestine documentaries. The British actress Vanessa Redgrave was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. John Lennon wrote checks to the Workers' Revolutionary Party and donated to them at one point. And they were a Trotskyist group that was very pro-Palestine and very supportive of both Gaddafi and Ba'ath socialism in Iraq and Syria, which I think is fascinating. And this book that is endorsed, it's got an endorsement on the back by Ken Livingston, the former mayor of London. This book maintains that the way Jerry Healy and the Workers' Revolutionary Party was taken down was a government operation. In the mid 80s, they suddenly filled the press with all kinds of sex scandals about Jerry Healy. And it destroyed their organization. It fractured the group. And Ken Livingston and this book make the case that this was some kind of MI5 operation. That this was done, basically, this was because of the fact that he was friendly to Gaddafi, because it was the British miners' strike was going on at the time, right? And they had been so key in supporting the miners in the 1984-85 miners' strike, led by Arthur Scargill, because they were tied in with Gaddafi and with Iraq and with Syria, that the British intelligence went after Jerry Healy. It's very fascinating, and Ken Livingston stands by it. He maintains, that they smeared and lied about Jerry Healy and just destroyed his reputation, as part of a government operation. It's actually very fascinating. I actually really enjoyed reading this. I'm not a Trotskyist, obviously, but Jerry Healy was this very prominent British Marxist who was pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, had a lot of influence among like Hollywood actors and rock stars like John Lennon and such, and was promoting anti-Zionism and promoting Gaddafi and supporting the miners' strike. And it looks like they smeared him. They got some people in his inner circle to accuse him of awful things, and they published a whole bunch of smears against him, and then they destroyed the organization. It's actually really fascinating to read about. So I just thought, since we're talking about Zionism and stuff like that, and I remember Ken Livingston had been raked through the mud because he dared point out about Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. I thought it was worth mentioning that Jerry Healy, who worked with Ken Livingston, he endorses the claim that this was the claims against Jerry Healy. The crazy allegations against Jerry Healy were a government operation. I think that's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating. And, the Healy, they call them the Healyites. The Healyites. Key takeaways from the German ideology. You ask tough questions. That's okay. Key takeaways from the German ideology. That's good. Keep the super chats rolling in. I'm here to answer your questions. But, Jerry Healy, he's a Trotskyist. I'm not into Trotskyism, right? Trotskyism's not my cup of tea, but I am a great admirer of Gaddafi. I really think Gaddafi was a great leader, an anti-imperialist, and I ranted about that on my last stream. And so I've been kind of mildly interested in Jerry Healy for a while. And then I heard about how Ken Livingston, I was just on here talking about how Ken Livingston was raked over the coals for the fact that he brought up about Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. And then I remembered that Ken Livingston, is on the record defending Jerry Healy. He actually endorsed this book and such. So I thought it might be good to just mention that, right? So there you go. There you go. Next question. All right. Replacing Henry Wallace with Truman to prevent and weaken the Cold War. It's funny because that's actually, I just talked about Harry Truman and all that. And thank you, Lion, for the super chat. I really do appreciate it. And thank you. I really do appreciate that, Lion. And I actually just answered. I went on about Truman and Henry Wallace for a very long time. So just scroll back in the stream. I answered that when I answered the thing about that. Recommended books on how the Soviets organized their bank. Their bank. That's interesting. Their bank. I mean, you know, the books that I generally recommend on the Soviet Union, right? I mean, there's a very thorough study of the Soviet economy that I do recommend. You know, I've got other super chats. I don't know why I'm answering this one now, but I guess I will. You know, this is volume 1. This is like the most thorough study of the Soviet economic and political system that I've ever seen, and it's called Soviet Communism: A New Civilization by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and it's in 2 volumes, and it goes into great detail about their economy. There's also a very good book from the 1980s, and it's called Cities Without Crisis, and it's by a member of the Communist Party USA, and he talks about the Soviet economy in the 1970s and 80s and what it was like. Cities Without Crisis might be a good place to start because he's talking about the Soviet economy. There's also there's a book called Soviet Economy Since 1917, I believe it's called. What, Soviet Economy Since 1917, right? I believe that's what it's called. By Maurice Dobb. Yeah, that's the book. Soviet Economy Since 1917 by Maurice Dobb. Very good explanation of the Soviet economic system. Trying to think what other books to learn about the Soviet economic system are there, right? I did Sidney and Beatrice Webb. I did Maurice Dobb. I did Cities Without Crisis. What other ones? You want specifically Soviet economics. That's what you're looking for. The Dean of Canterbury, the Red Dean of Canterbury. That guy wrote a lot of good stuff. Yeah, what was his name? What did they call him? Hewlett Johnson, right? Hewlett Johnson, the Red Dean of Canterbury, right? Yeah. You know, he was a very, very strong academic defender of the Soviet Union. He wrote a book called The Soviet Sixth of the World. He has some very good writings as well. Hewlett Johnson. I would recommend Hewlett Johnson and his writings as well. You know, another good source about Soviet economy, of all things, is the New York Times. The reporter that they had in Moscow, it's actually interesting. It's a wild story. But the reporter who was based in Moscow for the New York Times during the 1930s, you know, the guy is clearly not a communist. He writes awful things about Stalin. He writes awful things about the Soviet Union. He says that Stalin's not a communist. He's an Asiatic despot. He's like Genghis Khan. He's like the emperors of Japan. You know, he writes about how Stalin is the new czar. I mean, he writes stuff that's clearly not sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Walter Duranty was his name. However, he writes honestly about what he saw, which was a huge economic boom was happening in the Soviet Union. And he wrote these columns about, look, the rest of the world's having a Great Depression. Look what's happening in the Soviet Union. And he just describes with his own eyes how the country is rising up from poverty, how they're wiping out illiteracy, how they're building huge new industries, how they're industrializing very rapidly. He just describes what he saw, right? He was based in the Soviet Union, based in Moscow. He describes what he saw. Walter Duranty. There is this whole effort to take away his Pulitzer Prize, right? If you go to the website of the John Birch Society, if you go to some of these libertarian websites, they hate Walter Duranty and they say, oh, he's an apologist for genocide and all of that. Well, the Pulitzer Committee, which is not a group of liberals, I'll tell you that much. They are definitely not a group of liberals, not a group of anti-communists, you know, not a group of communists, not a group of Marxists. The Pulitzer Prize Committee did an investigation and they went through his work and they said, we haven't found a single thing that he ever lied about. He honestly reported what he saw, right? Walter Duranty reported what he saw. He saw that the Soviet Union was having an economic boom. And because he didn't accuse the Soviet government of committing genocide in Ukraine, and because he didn't accuse the Soviet government of being a monstrous evil regime, even though he wrote about them in very negative terms, there has been this whole effort to take his prize away. And they would I think they would really, really like to take his Pulitzer Prize away from him. But they can't find a single thing he ever lied about. That's the crazy thing. I mean, he won his Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Soviet Union in 1931. They can't find anything he supposedly lied about in his writing, right? That the information that he had living in Moscow in the Soviet Union, he was telling the truth about what he saw. He observed an economic boom. He observed the collectivization, and based on what he saw, he was telling the truth. And everyone there's been this whole campaign to revoke his Pulitzer Prize, and he's a Soviet apologist. He's a Stalin. He's a denier of Stalin's massacres. He's reporting what he saw. That's what he saw. With his own eyes, he saw an economic boom. He's not a communist. He writes very negatively about Stalin. He writes very negatively about the Soviet government, comparing it to the czars and Genghis Khan and saying they're not real Marxists, all that. That's not enough. The way the anti-communist paradigm works, if you don't write, Solzhenitsyn level, they killed millions of people, they never did good for anybody, communism is murderous and bloodthirsty and evil. If you don't write that, you're not respected. You are not allowed to acknowledge basic facts about the economy. The living standards in the Soviet Union under Stalin drastically improved. They industrialized a country. They raised millions of people from poverty. They wiped out illiteracy. They electrified the country. They built the biggest hydroelectrical power plants in the world. They built the biggest steel industry in the world. They built a modern oil industry. They had a tremendous economic achievements, improving the lives of millions of people. Millions of people in the country went from living in huts with no running water and no electricity to living in modern apartment buildings with running water and electrical lights. And it was an economic boom. It was an economic miracle what Stalin did in the 1930s with his 5-year economic plans. They mobilized the whole country to just build itself up from nothing. And you're not allowed to acknowledge that. It's shocking, but that shows you how blatantly biased. I'm going to show you a clip. Right? This is from a PBS documentary. I'm going to pull it up here. This is from a PBS documentary, and it's just they interview some Soviet women about what they witnessed, and they just describe the era that I'm talking about, right? Let me just pull this up. Hold on. This clip, I feel like it's one of the rare instances where it's like a PBS documentary from the 90s. Soviet Union's already fallen, and they're trying to explain to their viewers why anyone would like Stalin, why anyone would like communism. And so they interview these older women who lived under socialism in the USSR. Now, later in the documentary, they accuse Stalin of horrendous crimes and such, but because, the Soviet Union has already fallen, and because of the fact that this is a PBS documentary and they're honestly trying to understand why anyone would like the USSR, they had this clip, and I put it on my YouTube channel because I want people to see this, right? These are facts. Do you think PBS made all of this up? This is from a PBS documentary. This is from a PBS documentary from the 90s.
To produce engineers and technicians for the new society, training was expanded. And the communists said women should have equality with men, with equal pay. Ella Shishtir was one of a new generation of women.
Когда Ленин сказал, стране нужна электрификация, а коммунизм это советская...
When Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans, I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it. The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study.
Она давала мне право трудиться, учиться так, как я хочу.
Yodorova was held up as an example to others.
We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have. Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible at one of the most difficult times to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Teams of young activists were sent to the country.
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people. We made a note of their names. We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
Просто-напросто была огромная.
For Valentina Mikova and Mikhail Arkhipov, these were the most fulfilling days of their lives.
На строительстве домен был один экскаватор. И то плохой.
There was one excavator at the blast furnace building site, and it wasn't always reliable. So we dug all the foundations by hand.
Понимаете,
The trench would be teeming with people. One takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5 or 6 levels. That was how we got the earth out of the trench. Then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
There you go. That's PBS, folks. Now, do you believe that PBS, public broadcasting in America, is part of a communist conspiracy? Do you think they hired actors to pretend to be Soviet old people to tell those stories? We have been sold a load of bullshit in America. Socialism never worked, never accomplished anything. I mean, did you just see that? I mean, again, unless PBS is a secret communist conspiracy, they hired actors to pretend to be old people to read that script. I think communism worked. There's a reason that the Soviet Union became a world power and defeated the Nazis and invented space travel and, invented LED lights and the AK-47 rifle, but, there's just a refusal. You're not allowed to say that. And look, Walter Duranty, I mean, he was anti-communist New York Times writer, and he just, acknowledged what he saw, which was an economic boom around him. And oh my God, take his Pulitzer Prize away. That's how ridiculous American media is. It's really how ridiculous it is. Right. Gavin says PBS was bad then too, just not as much. Exactly. Right. And they cancel it out. If you watch this documentary, they cancel it out later with talk about gulags and stuff. They try to make you forget it. But because it's, the Soviet Union's gone, they figure, okay, let's try to talk about why people liked Stalin, why people liked the Soviet Union. And they showed that. And they would never show that now. Right. But, there was a reason that many people, admired. There was huge economic achievements from the Soviet Union, and you're not allowed to acknowledge that. It's just considered to be, off limits, reacting to certain communists supporting Pol Pot. Well, look, at the time that the Democratic Kampuchea existed, the government of Pol Pot, that was the time of the Sino-Soviet split. That was the 70s. And that was when the Soviet Union and China were at odds with each other. And China had drifted into the pro-US camp, right? And they drifted into the pro-US camp. And because of that, there was a lot of confusion. And the Gang of Four in China had maintained that one could get to full communism in poverty. It was actually one of their key principles, transition to a higher stage in poverty. And on top of that, there was a belief on the part of Pol Pot. He argued that they could have full communism on the basis of an agrarian economy, and that Pol Pot's Cambodia was aligned with China. They maintained that the Soviet Union were revisionists, and the Soviet social imperialists, and that they were a truly revolutionary country. They could go directly to communism in Cambodia on the basis of an agrarian economy. And because of the fact that China was considered by a lot of American Maoist communists to be more revolutionary than the Soviet Union, that they were taking leadership from China, there were a number of communists in the United States that supported Pol Pot. The first group of communists that supported Pol Pot was the Communist Workers' Party, the CWP, because they were taking direction from China. They took that position. I believe the October League supported Pol Pot. And actually, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, they ran articles in the 90s in their newspaper, kind of more or less defending Pol Pot. But they still were critical. They didn't really uphold it. They didn't say it was like their honorable thing. But there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of confusion at the time because the Soviet Union had been seen as the more reformist country that wanted to negotiate with the U.S. imperialists. And, the Vietnamese people had kicked the ass of U.S. imperialism. They were the heroes of the world. And on the part of a lot of people in the United States, even though Vietnam was fighting Cambodia, there was still a feeling like we want to support anyone in that part of the world who seems like a revolutionary. And there was distrust of the Soviet Union. There was a feeling the Soviet Union weren't as revolutionary as they should be. There was still a feeling that China was this beacon of revolutionary communism coming out of the Cultural Revolution. So it makes sense there was some confusion around that issue. Noam Chomsky defended Pol Pot, actually. And many people have pointed that out, that he wrote an article basically when they were being accused of committing genocide, saying that they hadn't committed genocide. And he actually kind of defends it. He says, well, look, he says, yeah, they did commit genocide. They did that later, but they were only in power for like a week, and immediately after taking power, people were making all these over-the-top allegations, when in reality, the bombing from the United States killed far more people. And, that the horrendous war forced on Vietnam and Cambodia by the United States, it killed far more people, etc. And that was a very common thing for people to say at the time because it wasn't clear, right? And Pol Pot was calling himself a communist. And the fact that he was being armed and supported by the United States was not something people were aware of at the time. That wasn't revealed until later. And he was calling himself a communist, and U.S. media was playing up his atrocities. And so people were confused, right? People were very, very confused. And China, that was considered to be a more revolutionary country, even though Mao was out of power, Deng Xiaoping was in power at that point. But regardless, China was considered to be a more revolutionary country than the Soviet Union, and China was supporting Pol Pot. And so there was a lot of confusion, right? And a lot of Maoists, supported Pol Pot mistakenly. Actually, if you really want to learn the history of Cambodia, I will be right back. I will show you a very important book on that topic. This book is probably the best book that I've ever read on Pol Pot. It's called Kampuchea, The Revolution Rescued. And it's by Erwin Silber. Erwin Silber was a Maoist folk singer in the United States. He was a Maoist communist, and he did folk music. And this book he wrote, Revolution Rescued, defends Vietnam's intervention into Cambodia. And it goes over the reality of the Pol Pot regime, and how it was not revolutionary. It was serving the imperialists, and how they were slaughtering the legit Communist Party of Cambodia. So I actually recommend if you want an English language book on this topic, I recommend Erwin Silber's Kampuchea, the Revolution Rescued, which basically explains why Vietnam felt compelled to intervene in Cambodia, which is very, very important. So yeah, this is a book I would recommend on that topic. If you're looking for an English language source on that issue, that's what I would recommend. But there you go. Yeah. Mao going up and coming down the mountain. Well, I mean, what I'm referring to is the Long March, right? So in the early 1930s, there was something called the Chinese Soviet Republic. It's wild. People don't even know about this, right? A lot of people who call themselves Maoists, the Chinese Soviet Republic, right? I'm dropping the Wikipedia page here in the chat group. 1931, the Chinese communists carved out a very big territory, a very big liberated territory in the heartland of China. And so they declared the Chinese Soviet Republic. And no one ever talks about this, right? But they had the Chinese Soviet Republic. Wow, global research. They had the Chinese Soviet Republic, and the Chinese Soviet Republic was a communist government established in China. And it was, you had the Republic of China that was led by Chiang Kai-shek. It was based in Beijing. And then you had the Chinese Soviet Republic. So Germany sent General Hans von Seeckt, who was a German general. And at that point, 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. A couple years later, you had Hans von Seeckt, Nazi Germany sent Hans von Seeckt to work with Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese KMT government to try and crush the Chinese Soviet Republic. And they were quite successful. And the Chinese Soviet Republic was surrounded and crushed. And Mao and the Chinese Red Army were forced to retreat up into the mountains. And so they retreated up into the mountains. And when they retreated up into the mountains, there was a group of people in the Chinese Communist Party who then tried to have a military coup against Mao. I forget what they were called. It was a certain number. It was like the 28 Bolsheviks or the 20 Bolsheviks or the 12 Bolsheviks. I forget which number. But they were a bunch of people that were in with Moscow. And they said Mao is a renegade. He's not following Stalin. He's not following the Comintern line. And so there's this group of people tried to overthrow Mao and have a coup against him. They said, Mao, look, he failed with, the Chinese Soviet Republic. It was crushed. We're fleeing up in the mountains. Mao's incompetent. We understand Stalin. We understand the Comintern line. And so there was actually an attempted coup against Mao. Now, most of the Chinese Red Army was sympathetic to Mao, and it was defeated. Mao remained in charge of the Chinese Red Army. But that shows you that when circumstances get hostile, right? When circumstances get hostile in revolutionary movements, you can be attacked from without, right? Attacked from outside, right? And that can result in internal confusion, right? So in response to this hostile attack that they faced from Chiang Kai-shek and Hans von Seeckt, internally, the Chinese Red Army, then you had this contradiction where the 28 Bolsheviks or the 12 Bolsheviks, I forget what they were called. It was this faction tried to overthrow Mao. So you had like a fight within the Red Army. Mao won out that fight. He defeated them. And so then Mao and his forces retreated into the mountains. And that's the Long March, which is famous, right? The Long March. It's a very, very famous event in Chinese history. The Long March. And it was, they went up into the mountains 1934 to 1935, and they marched for quite a long distance, right? It's about 5,600 miles over the course of 370 days. That's the Long March. Here, I'll drop the Wikipedia page. Have you ever heard of the Long March? And it was considered a very, very heroic and epic moment in the history of the Chinese Communist Revolution. Mao went up into the mountains to do the Long March. It was very difficult terrain. A lot of crazy things happened. There was like a famous battle where there was a bridge over like a bridge over a mountain chasm, right? And this bridge, I think it was over a river, but like a canyon kind of. It was like and this bridge, it had chain. It was like chains, and then it held across this by, you know, a wooden like planks, right? It was like a bridge. And so the KMT army, they painted the wooden planks on the bridge with gasoline, and they lit it on fire, and they burned out all the wood on the bridge. So all there was just the chains, the metal chains. And so while the KMT army was shooting at them, the Chinese communist soldiers were forced to cross the bridge just dangling from the chains. Can you imagine this, right? Going over a river while people are shooting at you, and you're like dangling from chains across a river, and they're just going across the river, you know, dangling from these chains because the wood on the bridge had been burned out, right? I mean, it's just you want to talk about an epic, heroic moment in history. That was the Long March, right? The other thing was that, you know, they were in the mountains. They were going to these remote regions. And they would go to a village, and the villages that they would go to would panic as soon as they saw soldiers, because these remote villages, they never saw soldiers. There were no police that they ever saw. There was no military people. They didn't have contact with civilization. And the only times they'd ever seen soldiers was when like some army would come and steal all their crops and rape all their women and rob them. So when Mao and his army would show up at a village, the villagers would panic and think, oh my God, they're going to rob us. And then they would get there. And if you read in the Little Red Book, one of the rules is that they're not allowed to even accept gifts from the peasantry. The Chinese Red Army, they weren't even allowed to even accept gifts. They had to pay for everything that they took from the peasantry. Not a spool of thread, nothing. If anyone gives you any food, if anyone gives you anything, no gifts. That was a way to avoid this whole thing, right? Because, you know, it might be if you show up, they're like, oh, here, take this, you know, but no, they had to pay for everything they took, you know, and when they would come, when the Chinese Communist Army would come to a village, the people would panic because the first time in like 20 years they'd seen soldiers, and the last time the soldiers came, they, you know, stole all their stuff and raped all the women and you know, were awful. Well, they would show up and they'd be really nice, and they would pay for everything that they took, and they would be really friendly and kind. And a lot of them joined the Red Army based on that. They'd be like, wow, this is a different kind of army. This Red Army that Mao is starting, this is a different kind of army. This is a completely different kind of army. And so as they were going through these villages in the mountains, many of the Chinese communists, many of the villagers would join the Red Army because of that. And they enforced the rules against theft. I mean, they had the death penalty. You know, if you were caught stealing from the peasants, you were caught raping women or whatever, they would execute you. They had a lot of executions in the Red Army. If you were, you know, if you were engaging in plunder, if you were, you know, doing things like that, they would execute you. So they were very strict to enforce that policy. But that was one of the strengths of the Red Army, is they treated the villagers very, very well. And their reputation really grew because word spread throughout the countryside, throughout the mountains, the countryside. There's this very new kind of army here, this Red Army. They're not like the other armies we've dealt with. I mean, this is not like any of the armies we've ever dealt with before. There's something special about them. And so they were recruiting people. And so as they're up in the mountains retreating, their forces are growing and they're recruiting more and more people. You know, and, you know, eventually when the Long March came to an end, you know, Mao came out much stronger. You know, if you look at where Mao was by 1935, 1936, the 8th Route Army, they were much, much stronger than when they retreated up into the mountains. By the end of the Long March, they were a very, very long, very, very effective army. They increased their size, they increased their standing among the population, and everyone thought they had been defeated. Everyone thought they had been completely crushed and destroyed, and they came down from the mountains, so to speak. They came out of the Long March much, much stronger. And that was a testament to their strength, was their resilience, right? That they overcame adversity. And they dealt with hostile circumstances. The Germans and the KMT had teamed up against them and crushed them. They'd had an internal contradiction with this attempted coup against Mao, but they managed to pull through it, and they ended up coming out even stronger than before. And that was considered to be quite an epic moment, right? And that's why, I mean, that's like a legendary moment in the history of Chinese communism. One of the best stories I ever heard in the history of Chinese communism was that, in the cities that were controlled by the KMT government, they didn't call it the Red Army, right? They didn't call it the People's Liberation Army, the Red Army, the Eighth Route Army. They called it, I'm laughing, Gavin. Yeah, very funny. That's good. But anyway, they didn't call it the Red Army. They called it the Red Bandit Army. They called it the Red Bandit Army. And it was just kind of this legendary group. It's like, it's like in the countryside, there's this group called the Red Bandit Army, the Red Bandit Army. And that's what they called them, the Red Bandit Army. And that they actually had a song that they played on the radio constantly. That they played on the radio to warn everybody about how bad the Red Bandit Army is. And the song they played on the radio, the lyrics translated to, "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" That's actually how the lyrics of the song translated. "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And they talked about how this song was played on the radio in China constantly, and in the cities. Chiang Kai-shek was constantly playing on the song. "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And they made kids sing it in school. So the kids were constantly walking around singing, "When Mao appears, killing and burning, what are you going to do?" People couldn't stand the song. They couldn't stand the song. It annoyed the shit out of them. Because everywhere they went, on the radio, they're hearing, "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And all the kids are singing in school, "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And the story goes that when the Red Army and the People's Liberation Army would march in to liberate a city, and they would actually march into the city, and the Red Army would march in, these people who were sick of the KMT, they were sick of Chiang Kai-shek, they were sick of the corruption, they were sick of years of China's humiliation. They would come out of their houses and they would raise their fists and salute the Red Army. And then they would sarcastically sing this song, "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do?" And they sung that song to celebrate the victory, right? They mockingly sung this horrendous, stupid, anti-communist song, "When Mao appears and he's killing and burning, what are you going to do? When Mao appears and he's killing and burning." And it's like, thank God Mao appeared. Thank God Mao appeared. And they would salute all of them. I think that's a badass story. That's a really touching, sweet story that I've heard, right? And it shows how sometimes propaganda can have the opposite effect. I guess in 21st century terms, you could say that they made the song into a meme. They made the song into a meme and it had the opposite effect, right? They made the song into a meme and it had the opposite effect. So that's Mao coming down from the mountain. I hope that satisfies you. Key takeaways from the German ideology. It's been a while since I read the German ideology, but my memory of the German ideology is that is a polemic. It's one of the early Marx pieces where Marx is polemicizing against German idealism. Right? The German idealists are saying that the mind and thought defines reality. Marx is sticking up for philosophical materialism. Thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, such things. Funny story about the German ideology. This is my German ideology story. I went to an awful college that will not be named. No one should ever go to that college. It's an awful place. It's an awful institution. I was not happy there. It is a glorified summer camp. And a lot of good professors there, but the actual academic institution is horrendous. I went to this awful college in Ohio. But one of the things that my awful college in Ohio did was they had this course that you had to take, and it was LAS 150, Liberal Arts and Sciences 150. And it was a course that everyone had to take. Didn't matter what your major was. You majored in business, you majored in biology, you majored in sports medicine, you majored in economics. No matter who you are, everyone was required to take LAS 150. And it was this course that was supposed to help you learn to think like a sophisticated college person, right? It was Liberal Arts and Sciences 150. And the college printed their own textbook for this course, right? They didn't use anyone else's textbook. They printed their own textbook. Seriously? Oh my God, that's hilarious. Is that true? Anyway, Gavin, you are full of surprises tonight. If that is true, that is hilarious. But anyway, everyone had to take LAS 150. And the college wrote their own textbook for LAS 150. It was assembled by the faculty. And they had writings by important thinkers throughout history, the writings from Plato and writings from Immanuel Kant and writings from, Thomas Jefferson. And, it was all this, all of this, the important thinkers, right? Anyway, in LAS 150, they had two passages from Karl Marx. Because Marx is an important thinker. So they had two passages from Karl Marx. One of them was a passage from the German Ideology. The German Ideology is an early philosophical book by Karl Marx. It's about refuting German idealism. It's not about communism. It has nothing. It's about philosophy, right? It's when Marx is, in his early Marx, he's talking philosophy. Later, he's talking politics. And then in his final years, he's focused on economics. This is early Marx when he's the young left Hegelian. He's arguing for materialism against idealism. That's what it is. It's the early Marx. So our assignment, the way it would work is we would have to read the passage. And then the next day we would come to LAS 150 class and we would have to discuss it. So I remember I took LAS 150. We were assigned to read this passage from the German Ideology about how do you determine what is true and nothing to do with communism. It's just philosophy, right? So we come into the class and I'm in this class and it's, sports and business majors, sports medicine majors and business majors, biology majors and education majors and all kinds of people. We're sitting in this class and we're assigned to read this passage from the German Ideology. So the professor is up in front of the class and he's like, all right, what did people learn from the German Ideology? What did people learn from it? This girl raises her hand. I thought the part where he said that everyone should get paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. I didn't agree with that. I think you should get paid more money if you work hard. Other student raises your hand. The part where he says we should have a brutal dictatorship to make sure that everyone's equal. I didn't agree with that. I believe in freedom. And I sat there and I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? These kids didn't read the piece. They didn't read it. And they just assumed because it's written by Karl Marx, Karl Marx is this stupid guy who thought everyone should get paid the same. You have to be retarded to believe in communism. I mean, it was infuriating to me. And the worst part was the professor just went right along with it. I'm sorry, but it's maybe there's part of me that's rigid and authoritarian, but the professor should have stepped in and gone, what page was that on, Johnny? Yeah, what page was that on, Susie? Tell me the passage that you didn't agree with. They didn't read it, right? They just assumed they had this caricature in their head of what Marxism was, right? They had this caricature of what Marxism is, right? And the professor just went along with it. It just went right along with it. Just thought, what the heck? I guess, thank God I don't have to be a college professor, right? Thank God that I don't have to be a teacher or a college professor and have situations like that. Maybe I would just go along with it, right? Maybe you learn after a while that you got to pick your battles. But no, the professor read it. And I was just like, are you shitting me? I was sitting there. I'm like, I couldn't believe it. Right. And that's just, but that's the crazy thing is that's what most people do. That's even what BreadTube does. Right. BreadTube, they think socialism is a worker cooperative scheme. They think it's an employee stock ownership program. They must never have read Marx because, socialism, utopian and scientific, the Communist Manifesto pretty clearly means we're abolishing the anarchy of production, state central plan. It doesn't mean you start a pencil factory with your friends, but BreadTube's never read it either, right? It's everyone has this caricature in their head of what Marxism is. And it ain't that. It ain't that, right? I mean, Marxism, dialectical materialism, right? I mean, so many people told me they knew all about communism. They'd read Marx. They understood communism. And yeah, Tyler says that's absolutely how. Show me that page, Johnny. Let's read it together. Exactly. I was like, are you shitting me? Right. But yeah, like, you know, maybe I don't know. Good for you, Tyler. But yeah, like, you know, everyone has this caricature in their head of what Marxism is, right? And, you know, the phrase dialectical materialism. I had many people explain to me they knew all about Marxism. They'd studied Marx. They knew Marx. And then I would say, okay, what do you think of dialectical materialism? And they'd say, what? And it's like, how can you not know what Marxism is? And you know all about Marxism, but you've never heard of dialectical materialism. That is like the entire basis. Marx was talking about dialectical materialism before he was talking about communism, right? Before Marx was a communist, he was a dialectical materialist, right? That was the basis of the whole thing, right? Marx was a young philosophy student who got into, developed dialectical materialism. From that, he developed communism. And from that, he developed, you know, economic theories, right? It was, you know, this is Marx's life. And it's funny because in academia, they have this narrative where like the early Marx goes against the late Marx, right? I don't know all the details about all of that, but, you know, that's, academia has worked really, really hard. And that's part of their narrative. Is like, well, Marx changed his views. Young Marx thought this, old Marx thought that. And I've heard some classic Marxists say that's malarkey. There's some people who argue that there's the philosophical Marx versus the academic Marx. This is what I will say about Karl Marx. This is one thing that must be said about Karl Marx, is that Karl Marx was an activist. And that gets obscured. There's like the movie about the life of Karl Marx. You would think that Karl Marx sat around writing books all the time. That is not the truth. And the anime about Marx, you know, the anime about Karl Marx that a good friend of mine showed me is better. There's a Chinese like anime film about Marx. It's a little bit better on this front. Karl Marx was not this ivory tower intellectual. That's what people think, right? The way the biographies of Marx are written, you would think that Karl Marx sat around writing books all the time. Well, Karl Marx did write books, yes. And Karl Marx he wrote for newspapers, he wrote books and all of that. But everything that Karl Marx wrote was considered to be a boost or an aid to activism, right? Karl Marx's entire life was a life of struggle and organizing and protest. And his writing was done to clarify and give guidance to actual activism, right? For example, right? 1848, the German Revolution. That was an armed conflict. That was a war. People died in the German Revolution. And in the German Revolution, the Communist League was one of the armed factions. Karl Marx's group that he wrote the Communist Manifesto to be their statement of principles, they were an actual armed group that participated in the German Revolution of 1848. They were one of the armed factions that was rising up, fighting under the demand of creating a modern German nation state. There were nationalist factions, there were Catholic, Protestant and Anabaptist factions, and there was the Communist League, and Karl Marx was the leader of it, and he was participating in armed violent uprising. Marx was on the barricades. Marx carried a gun and shot a gun and was in armed conflict. That's activism. After Marx fled to Germany, or after he fled Germany, you know, even when he was living in London, right? When he was living in London, we always hear about him going to the British Museum, how he was poor all the time. They were always out of money. And Karl Marx went to the British Museum and he sat in the waiting room of the British Museum to get statistics and data with which to write capital. But what they don't tell you about is that he was constantly leading protests and strikes by workers, and that his International Working Men's Association, they were on the picket lines and they were striking and protesting and marching. And Karl Marx was the leader of the International Working Men's Association. So he was on the picket lines and he was meeting with the leaders of labor unions and the leaders of protest groups, and he was organizing with them and coordinating with them. So Marx was doing that. You know, Marx's daughter, Jenny Marx, she got heavily involved in support for the Irish people, and they protested against the executions of Irish people, right? They were executing Irish freedom fighters in London. They would hang Irish freedom fighters, and Jenny Marx would protest the execution of Irish freedom fighters. And even though she was of Jewish heritage from an atheist family, she wore a crucifix around her neck everywhere she went to support the Irish people who were Roman Catholic. Karl Marx organized rallies in London to support Abraham Lincoln and to oppose slavery. Mass meetings against slavery were held, where Karl Marx was a speaker, and Karl Marx helped organize those mass meetings in support of the Union Army and against slavery. Karl Marx's only job that he ever had, he only ever had 2 jobs in his life. He briefly worked for a railroad, and he got fired because his handwriting was too sloppy. And after that, his only other job was he worked for the New York Tribune, which was the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. And he wrote, London correspondence for a Republican newspaper. Karl Marx organized support for the Paris Commune. When the workers of Paris rose up and had the Paris Commune, Karl Marx was organizing rallies of the labor unions and the progressive forces, rallying to support the Paris Commune of 1871. I mean, Marx was an activist his whole life. He was engaged in struggle, and Marx's writing, his writing on philosophy was teaching people how to understand the world. The old feudal system that's being propped up by the Catholic Church is being overthrown. So he's coming out, he's teaching people a new way of thinking that's based in dialectical materialism. And then in 1848, as the German Revolution is breaking out, he's built his own revolutionary armed group called the Communist League that's part of the uprising. They're part of the revolt, and he has to flee the country. He has to flee Germany because he's been part of this armed revolution that fails, right? He's living in Paris, right? His pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, one of his most important pamphlets. It's an agitational pamphlet, and it's written because he was in the middle of strikes and protests, and there was a military coup by Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, who becomes the military dictator, the emperor of France. And there's, there's workers' strikes, and there's the lumpen, the Society of December 10th, and the lumpen mobs are out there. Karl Marx was in the middle of all of that. And Karl Marx in London, he's the leader of the International Working Men's Association, organizing solidarity and protests in support of Ireland, organizing solidarity and protests in support of the struggle against slavery, on the picket lines with striking workers. Karl Marx was an organizer. He was an activist. He was not an academic, right? Karl Marx was never a college professor. He went to college. He studied in university. Karl Marx was not a college professor. Karl Marx was not this pointy-headed intellectual who just sat around writing books. He did write books. He did a huge amount of research, and he spent a lot of time sitting in the waiting room of the British Museum, and he spent a lot of money. He ran out of money constantly because he was going to the British Museum to get data. You couldn't Google things back then, so all the statistics and data and information was being held at the British Museum, and that's why where he was spending all his money to go get it so he could write Capital and other things. But the idea that Karl Marx was this dude who sat around writing books, it's just not true. Karl Marx was a revolutionary organizer and an activist. And that gets obscured. They don't want you to know about that Marx. They want you to know about Marx, the writer, Marx, the thinker, and all of that. But you don't understand Marx if you don't understand this, right? If you don't have that proper context for Marx, you don't understand Marx. Right? And I will say this is a piece of wisdom that I've taken from Sam Marcy. This is Marcyism. Sam Marcy would rant about this. I've seen video of Sam Marcy, videotapes where Sam Marcy would make this point. But if you're not involved in organizing, trying to build socialist and communist organizations, trying to build coalitions with people, if you're not in struggle, you really don't understand Marxism. You really don't, right? Because the whole premise of Marxism is that history is driven forward by contradiction, by struggle, the dialectic, right? Historical materialism, opposing class forces. And Marx makes a lot more sense to you if you are involved in revolutionary organizing, right? If you're not involved in revolutionary organizing, if you view this in an abstract way, it's just some interesting theories, it's confusing to you. When I first opened Marx, I expected I was going to get a blueprint of an ideal communist society, and you will not find that in Marx. You won't. Marx doesn't actually talk that much about communism. I mean, he talks about class struggle, he talks about it, but in terms of what the ideal communist world will look like, he doesn't really say that much about it. In his economic manuscripts, he touches on it a little bit. And in the Critique of the Goethe Program, he explains the material basis for it. But Marx spent his life as an organizer. He was a labor organizer. He was a fighter for democratic rights against feudalism. He was an anti-slavery organizer. He was a builder of international solidarity with Ireland and with, you know, the struggle against slavery in the United States. Karl Marx was an organizer. And if you are involved in revolutionary organizing, and if you're part of a communist organization, when you read Karl Marx's writing, it's like reading it with a magical glasses on. It makes more sense to you. It sounds completely different. The words make more sense because it matches your lived experience. Marx is meant to be read by those who read it in struggle. And I'll tell you, this is a really common experience. At university, they'll teach Marxism, usually in the philosophy department. They will teach Marxism. And a lot of young people that are interested in revolutionary ideas will take that course, and the course will suck. And they'll be like, what the hell is this course? Because it's taught by somebody who's not an activist. It's taught by someone who's not in a communist group. It's taught by someone who's not involved in the struggle. And because they're not involved in the struggle, the Marx doesn't make any sense to them. They don't understand it, right? You can't understand Marx if you're not involved in the struggle yourself, right? And this sounds bizarre. I know this sounds weird. It sounds like Caleb's saying it's magical. Like if you're involved in a struggle, suddenly Marx, you know, the words are different or something. They're not different. But when you're actually involved in revolutionary organizing, Marx and the words that he writes strike you in a completely different manner. You have an understanding of what he's saying that you can only get through lived experience. This is what Mao is talking about in his essay, Where Do Correct Ideas Come From correct practical experience, right? You cannot learn Marxism. You cannot relate to what Karl Marx is saying correctly. And you cannot really digest what he's saying if you are not an activist. If you're not in a communist organization, if you're not, you know, working with comrades, if you're not trying to agitate and propagate, if you're not trying to build networks and communities of solidarity and resistance, reading Marx doesn't sound the same. It's not the same, right? And this sounds very idealist. This sounds almost spiritual, but I mean, it's the truth. I mean, and it's not just Marx. There are other things in life, you know. When I tried to read The Grapes of Wrath in high school, I was like, what the fuck is this? And then when I was in college, after the great financial crisis and after I was involved in protests in support of labor unions, I read The Grapes of Wrath and I was like, oh, wow, it struck me completely different, right? You know, and that often a lot of things that you read or movies that you see or songs or speeches that you hear, it's in the eye of the beholder. You take with you your own preconceived notions, your own life experiences, right? You take that with you, right? So if you are actually involved in revolutionary organizing, when you read Marx, you get so much more out of it. It has so much more of a meaning for you. And if you just read it in the abstract, like you might read a philosophical book by Immanuel Kant, or you might read Nietzsche, and it's like Marx is just this famous philosopher. Marx is just this intellectual. It's like, who am I going to read this week? Who did my professor assign you to read? You're not really getting Marx. You're not really getting Marx. Marx is meant to be read by people who are living a life like Karl Marx led, a life of struggle. People that have comrades, people that are in a revolutionary organization. And if you read it in that context, it strikes you in a completely different way. And that's why the breadtube people can't understand Marxism. They cannot. You watch their videos on it. They're cringe. They're embarrassing. Right? I mean, some of these videos where they're trying to explain what Marx meant, they don't know what he meant. These people have never been organizers. They're just, farting on the internet. They're just, making YouTube videos about why you should vote for Joe Biden, right? They don't understand it, right? They've never been in revolutionary groups. They've never been in activist organizations. So Marx is not something they can really understand. They've been told to be Marxists because the right wing hates Marxism and is always calling everyone a socialist, and the right wing is who they're supposed to fight. And they've been subsidized and propped up by the establishment as the voices of Marxism, but they don't understand it, right? Marxism is an ideology that is inherently opposed to the power structure. What they're doing is they have a gig. They've got a gig defending the power structure. So they don't get it. And they're not involved in any activism. They haven't been in socialist groups. They haven't engaged in revolutionary organizing. They have no idea about it. Right. And they think it means worker cooperatives that, they try to explain like the formulas M plus C plus M or what. I mean, they don't get it. They don't get it. Right. They really don't get it, because in order to really get it, you have to be living it. You have to live a life of struggle. And once you start living a revolutionary life, and once you join revolutionary organizations, and once you give your life to being an organizer, you don't have to give your whole life. Obviously, people have jobs and wives and kids and families. But when you are involved in the struggle, it'll make sense to you. It'll make a lot more sense to you. You'll get a lot more out of it. And Jason makes me want to go crack open the German ideology and see how it strikes me now. But there you go. Have there been successful non-revolutionary, have there been successful non-left adventurous communist parties in South America? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Great example would be Venezuela, right? The Communist Party is part of the ruling coalition, right? I think they recently had a falling out with Chavez, but most of the good people in the Communist Party they merged into the United Socialist Party. The Communist Party that currently exists is a little bit ultra-left from what I understand. But, the PSUV is a Marxist party. Hugo Chavez's movement for the Fifth Republic, it merged with a number of the communist groups into the United Socialist Party. They were not left adventurist. They took power via elections, but then they survived an attempted coup. They then ratified a new constitution. They restructured the military. And yeah, the Venezuelan United Socialist Party, the Sandinistas. Now, they were not left adventurist. I mean, the civil war was forced on them. But they won the Civil War, and then they stayed in power in the 80s as the USA fomented unrest against them, etc. They got voted out of office in the early 90s. Then in 2006, they were voted back into office. They're a Marxist party. I wouldn't call them left adventurist. Yeah, I mean, there's other examples. But, left adventurism, the essence of left adventurism is that you're engaging in acts of violence that are isolated from the masses. You have no chance of winning. You have no base among the population. It's just something that you're doing for the sake of feeling good about yourself, for the sake of feeling romantic or revolutionary. There's no chance of actually winning, and the masses don't support you. You haven't tried a peaceful transition. The road of peaceful struggle is open, but you want to do violence anyway just because violence is exciting or something. That's the essence of left adventurism. Left adventurism always fails. And I would say even the parties that have come to power in violent revolutions, like in Cuba, that's not left adventurism. It wasn't left adventurism. The population largely supported Fidel Castro, right? The population supported it. And Batista's regime, they couldn't have a peaceful transition. It was locked out. They were locked out of the ability to have a peaceful transition. They were forced to engage in an armed revolution to defend their democratic rights. I mean, the FARC in Colombia, they preferred a peaceful transition, but again, they were forced into an armed struggle. Now, later in the 90s, they chose to continue armed struggle even when their legal wing, the Communist Party, and others requested they lay down their arms and join the government. But, left adventurism, what you call left adventurism, is a specific deviation where people are engaging in violence for violence sake. Opinions on the shining path. Crazy, right? That's what left adventurism is, and it fails. And You know, in the 70s and 80s in Latin America, there were a lot of armed communist uprisings. Those were not left adventurist uprisings. They were usually uprisings against brutal military juntas. It was the fact that you couldn't organize peacefully. You couldn't organize in the cities. So communists were forced to flee to the countryside and organize among the peasantry and among the indigenous people and the poor people in the countryside and engage in guerrilla warfare. I don't consider that to be adventurism because that's what they had to do. They had no choice. The road of peaceful transition was cut off. The government was authoritarian and military. The indigenous people, in a lot of cases, were being murdered and suffering genocide. In Guatemala, you had Rios Montt committing genocide against the indigenous folks. They had no choice but to defend themselves and fight back. So I don't consider the armed, military campaigns of the 70s and 80s to have been left adventurism. I don't consider that to be the case. I think that they would have preferred a peaceful transition. And Che Guevara said this, Fidel Castro said that we would prefer a peaceful transition, but the ruling class won't allow it, right? They responded to our peaceful organizing with violence. They cut off the road of peaceful struggle. So we have to do that. And the Tricontinental Congress that was formed by Che Guevara, the Cuban government sponsored all these armed revolts across Latin America. That wasn't by choice. That was because the USA was backing up brutal military regimes. They had no choice. Later, you'll notice in the late 80s and the 90s, when these military regimes started falling, when these societies started to open up, then they transitioned to organizing peacefully. And the Bolivarian methods, right? The Bolivarian revolutions were largely peaceful, popular fronts against austerity, right? The neoliberal austerity was just destroying these countries. And so they built, popular front governments, right? And that's the thing. If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And the Cuban government, sponsored all kinds of conferences about neoliberalism where communists from South and Central America would get together. And they oriented the communists of South and Central America to change their tactics very rapidly in response to the fall of the Soviet Union, in response to the changing political climate in Latin America. And Bolivarian socialism is largely a result of the bravery and the initiative and the innovation of the communists of South America that took leadership from the Cuban Communist Party. The Cuban Communist Party. I have books printed in the 90s, by Fidel Castro, where he's talking about neoliberalism. He's talking about austerity, and that in the 90s, there was a reorientation. The communist movement of Latin America reoriented. In the 70s and 80s, it was armed struggle. And in the 90s, it was popular front, build a popular front against austerity. And the popular front tactic worked. In Venezuela, it worked. In Nicaragua, it got the Sandinistas back into power. It brought progressive governments into Bolivia and into Ecuador, and it was a very effective tactic. So there you go. All right. Michelle Chosadovsky and Global Research. I love that website. I've learned a lot from that website. And, they publish a variety of anti-imperialist stuff. It's a website from Canada, the Center for Global Research. And I mean, they've republished my stuff before. Great. I like what they publish. Not everything that they publish I would agree with, obviously. But, I really don't appreciate this cancel culture. Oh, so-and-so is a conspiracy theorist. So-and-so is that. I mean, I would rather people be questioning the status quo than blindly believing it. Right. The Center for Global Research, they question it. I don't endorse everything they've ever published, but I'm not ashamed that they've published my work. And I don't like the cancel culture. Good media immediately gets smeared, whether it's Mint Press or RT or Press TV, no matter what it is. Good media immediately gets labeled disinformation, gets labeled propaganda, and I don't play that game, Read it for yourself. There's stuff on Global Research I don't agree with, but I don't disown the website. I'm not going to go, take my articles down from there. I don't want anyone to think I'm associated with those bad people. I don't think that at all, and they were at the center of a controversy because a Chinese government official tweeted them out when they said that COVID may have originated in the United States. Well, now Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, prominent economist, UN official, Jeffrey Sachs now says it could have originated in the United States. There's a very strong chance that it originated in the United States. So what global research got canceled for saying is now accepted by one of the most prominent economists in the United States, Jeffrey Sachs. So, I mean, and that shows you. And then there's many examples of this where, somebody that's considered fringe or a conspiracy or whatever will say something, and everyone will go, oh my God, how dare they? How dare they say such a thing? And then it turns out to be true. And there's never any apology, and there's never any recognition that these people were right. And the cancelers and the haters just continue with their hate as if nothing happened, right? There's never any apology. Now, Jeffrey Sachs and a number of people say, you know what? There's a very good chance COVID started in the United States. And global research got canceled for saying that, Are there articles they've published that have turned out to be wrong? Maybe. I mean, but there's a lot they've published that turned out to be right. It's an anti-imperialist website, I don't know their personal views. I don't know their views on every issue. They publish anti-imperialist stuff. I don't see them advocating hate crimes. I don't see them defending U.S. wars. I don't see them, calling for violence or anything like that. So, looks like a good website to me. Am I missing something? Is there some recent controversy with them? I mean, looks to me like they're just, they're an anti-imperialist website. So there you go. Opinions on the Shining Path. Crazy, right? Well, I like the fact that they eat babies because I eat babies, right? They boiled babies. I eat babies. So no, I'm just kidding. But no, in all honesty, the Shining Path, I don't have a particular admiration for, because, they engaged in violence, against Cuba, violence against China. They bombed the Chinese embassy. They engaged in a huge amount of violence against other communist groups. Many people in Peru are utterly horrified by them. They alienated a lot of people in Peru. They engaged in a really horrendous campaign of violence. And if you were going to have a communist revolution in Peru and started in the countryside, you would want to build like a united front, right? You'd want labor unions in the cities to join you. You'd want other communist groups to like merge with you. They didn't do that. They killed labor unionists. They killed leaders of other communist groups, right? And they mobilized a lot of people in the countryside to, engage in a lot of violence. Now, to be fair, in Peru, there was a lot of discrimination against the indigenous people. The indigenous people, very dark-skinned folks, live in the countryside. They've suffered a lot. They've suffered horrendously. And the Peruvian government ignored those people. And they were kind of left behind. And it looks like because of those folks were suffering and losing their land, the resentment and the anger of the rural population of Peru, the indigenous folks, it enacted itself with El Sendero Luminoso. But overall, I don't think the Shining Path was a good group. I mean, just the fact that it ended because they caught the leader, right? They caught the leader. He lived, he was hiding out, upstairs. He lived in an apartment above a ballet studio, and they caught him, and that was it. Then the war was over. That shows you it was kind of a cult of personality, I mean, the group committed a lot of really unnecessary, horrendous atrocities. And on top of that, they were violent to all the other communists, and they were against China. They were against Cuba. They were against the trade unions of Peru. They alienated everyone in Peru, and they, at the same time, waged a campaign of violence. So I really don't have a very positive opinion of El Sendero Luminoso. I really don't. I just see them as an extremist terrorist group. I mean, if one was looking to seriously bring socialism to Peru, one would operate quite differently. And a lot of their material, people didn't even know they were communists, right? A lot of their material just seems like some crazy religious group or something, the Shining Path, and they would just spray paint everywhere. Viva Presidente Gonzalo, join the Shining Path. People thought it was people thought it was a religious group or something. Like people didn't even know. And a lot of what they preached was like peasant utopianism. It wasn't even communism. I mean, they didn't talk about Marxist economics. They didn't talk about class struggle. It was all just kind of, well, we're going to come together and join our movement and we'll take over the government and we'll make the world, we'll make the world good. And that, the problem with MLM, what they call Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, right? Because it's like, so, China, they never talked about Maoism. They talked about Marxism, Leninism as their ideology, and then Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping theory. They never talked about Maoism. That's not in China. They never talked about that. It was 1982. Then a number of parties had a meeting and they formed the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement. And then they signed a declaration, long live Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. That's the Revolutionary Communist Party of the United States and the Bobavakian people. And that's the Shining Path in Peru. And they were the Maoists of Nepal, but they've changed, actually. They got on the road to taking power and they got much more politically mature. They've changed their orientation. There's some other groups, some groups in India, the Naxalites in India, and some of these other groups. And, if you read their literature, it's not about class struggle. It's not about economics. It's not about socialism. It's not about labor unions. It's about the state is bad. We're going to get guns together and we're going to take over the state. And when we take over, it's good. Well, that's not Marxism, right? That is a deviation, right? That's Blanquism. That's Louis Auguste Blanqui, right? The Blanquists, right? You can impose communism from above, focusing on simply challenging and seizing state power, not building a mass movement, not engaging in economic struggle. It's all just a struggle for control of the state, right? And if you carry out a military coup, you violently seize control of the state, then you create communism from above. This is a theory that Marx fervently argued against, right? It was around a lot during Marx's day, right? The Lassalleans and the Blanquists. This was a very big revolutionary current in France. The argument that you can create communism from above, and the focus is on just waging some kind of military struggle to bring people that want to create communism into control of the state. That's the theory. And it is contrary to the Marxist world perspective. The Marxist perspective says, well, no, it's a struggle to mobilize the working class and build a movement of the working class. Read the polemics that Marx wrote against Blanqui and Louis Auguste Blanqui. Read about that. So there you go. All right, folks, it's been fun. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.